For 2 long years, I believed my career was permanently destroyed. I spent 6 grueling months sleeping in my freezing car, collecting over 400 job rejections, utterly convinced I was a failure. Then, a single mistaken email from a careless assistant exposed the terrifying truth. I was never unhireable. My own parents had been secretly sending forged documents to every employer claiming I was a convicted felon. When my father finally demanded I come home and surrender my remaining rights, he had no idea I was about to uncover a hidden inheritance that would burn his entire pristine life to the ground. I am Claire, 35 years old, and my office used to be on the 50th floor overlooking the Chicago skyline as a top-tier brand strategist. Now my entire existence is crammed into the back seat of a battered Honda Civic. Before I continue this story, and show you exactly how I destroyed their web of lies, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic family members deserve to face the consequences of their actions. Growing up in our affluent suburban neighborhood image was the only currency my parents valued. My father Richard demanded perfection, and my mother Brenda echoed his every command. I always thought my sudden fall from grace was just terrible luck, a string of bad interviews, and a tough corporate market. The reality was much more sinister. It was a brutally cold Tuesday morning in November. I woke up shivering violently under 2 thin wool blankets. The windows of my car were coated in a thick layer of frost, blocking out the gray morning light. My back ached from sleeping across the uneven back seat, a pain that had become a constant companion over the last 6 months of homelessness. I sat up, my breath pluming in the freezing air, and reached for my phone on the dashboard. The battery was at 14%. I had just enough power to check my email before I would have to start the engine and waste my precious remaining gas just to run the heater. I opened my inbox, hoping against hope for a lifeline. Instead, sitting right at the top was an email from a prestigious marketing firm downtown. It was my 412th rejection. The wording was exactly the same as the others. Thank you for your interest, but we have decided to move forward with other candidates whose backgrounds better align with our company values. I stared at the glowing screen, feeling a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. I had nailed that interview. The hiring manager had practically offered me the position in the room, praising my portfolio and my decade of experience. And then, just like all the others, complete radio silence followed by a generic rejection. I dropped the phone into my lap and pressed the heels of my hands against my burning eyes. I was so exhausted, so completely broken down by the constant failure, that I actually started to believe I was worthless. I wondered if I should just give up, drive back to my parents' house, and beg for their help. It was exactly what they had been waiting for. Every week, my father would send a condescending text asking when I was going to swallow my pride and admit I needed his guidance. I was just about to turn the key in the ignition when my phone let out a sharp ping. I picked it up again, expecting another rejection or a spam message. But the sender name made my brow furrow in confusion. It was from an email address I did not recognize immediately, but the domain name belonged to my brother-in-law, Jamal. Jamal is an African-American tech entrepreneur who married my sister Allison, and he runs a startup that my family constantly praises as the next big thing. The sender was his executive assistant. The subject line simply read, "Forward background check documents for Claire. Please file." My heart did a strange flutter against my ribs. Why would Jamal's assistant be sending me anything, let alone something about a background check? I tapped the screen with a trembling finger. As the message loaded, it became immediately clear that this was a catastrophic administrative error. The assistant had intended to forward the email to their internal human resources department, but had carelessly typed my email address from their contact list instead. I scrolled down past the assistant's signature block to see the original message thread. What I saw made the blood freeze in my veins. The original sender was my father, Richard. He had sent this email directly to the hiring manager at the marketing firm I had just been rejected from, copying Jamal on the message. Attached to the email was a heavy document file. I clicked the attachment, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. The document filled my screen complete with forged state seals and official-looking court headers. It was a criminal background check completely fabricated, bearing my full name, my social security number, and my previous address. Under the section labeled Criminal History, there was a glaring red-flagged entry: felony conviction, first-degree corporate embezzlement, grand larceny. The document detailed a completely fictional narrative where I had allegedly stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from my previous employer, resulting in a quiet termination and a sealed conviction to avoid public scandal. I could not breathe. The air in the car suddenly felt too thin. I scrolled back up to read the text of the email my father had written to the hiring manager. His words were carefully crafted, dripping with fake paternal concern and calculated venom. He wrote to the hiring committee. As Claire's father, it breaks my heart to write this, but I feel a moral obligation to protect your company. Claire has struggled with severe ethical issues and mental instability. We have tried everything to help her, but she refuses treatment. I have attached her sealed background documents for your reference. For the safety of your financial assets, I strongly advise against bringing her into your organization. Please keep this communication confidential, as we are trying to manage her condition privately. I read the words again, and then a third time. The suffocating weight of failure that had been crushing me for 2 years instantly evaporated, replaced by a blinding, white-hot rage. I was not unhireable. I was not a failure. Every single time I got close to securing a job, every time I made it to the final round of interviews, my own flesh and blood had been hunting down the hiring managers and poisoning the well. My father had systematically dismantled my life using Jamal's tech resources and connections to track my applications and intercept my success. They had watched me lose my apartment. They had watched me sell everything I owned. They had watched me move into my car as winter approached, all while playing the concerned family members, waiting for me to hit rock bottom. They did not want to help me. They wanted to break me. They needed me completely dependent, completely destroyed and isolated from the rest of the world. I threw the thin wool blankets off my lap. The cold did not bother me anymore. A strange, terrifying calm washed over me. I was no longer the confused, desperate woman crying over a rejection letter. I was a woman who had just been handed the exact blueprint of her own destruction and the names of the architects. I saved the email, downloaded the forged document, and forwarded everything to a secure cloud drive. I turned the key in the ignition. The old engine sputtered and roared to life. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the icy parking lot, heading straight toward the gated community where my parents lived. I did not know yet why they had gone to such psychotic lengths to ruin my life, but I was going to walk into their Sunday dinner and tear the truth out of them. The tires of my Honda spun against the sleet-covered asphalt as I forced the car onto the main road. The heater rattled violently, blowing lukewarm air against my numb fingers, but I barely felt the cold anymore. My blood was roaring in my ears. I had barely made it 2 blocks from the diner parking lot when the screen of my phone lit up on the passenger seat. The notification chime pierced the silence of the car. I glanced down at the glowing screen. It was a text message from my father. I reached over, unlocked the phone with my thumb, and kept my eyes on the icy road ahead. The message was not an apology. It was not a check-in to see if his homeless daughter had survived the freezing night. It was an ultimatum typed out with the cold precision of a corporate merger. It read, "Come home and apologize to your sister. We are all waiting for you. Sign the conservatorship papers today or the rejections will not stop. You are not well, Claire. Let us take over." I slammed my foot on the brake at a red light, staring at those words. Conservatorship. The word echoed in the cramped space of my car like a gunshot. It all clicked into place with terrifying clarity. They did not just want me unemployed. They wanted me legally erased. By destroying my career and forcing me onto the streets, they were creating a documented paper trail of instability. They were manufacturing a crisis to present to a judge. "Look at our poor daughter," they would say. "She is homeless. She cannot hold a job. She is clearly suffering from a mental breakdown. Give us total control of her finances, her medical decisions, her entire existence. My phone chimed again. A second text. This one from my sister Allison. Where are you? Mom is slicing the prime rib and you are ruining the schedule. If you are going to beg for a bed, at least be on time. I threw the phone onto the passenger seat. I did not cry. I did not scream or hit the steering wheel. The time for tears had passed months ago when I was sleeping in parking garages and eating expired granola bars. Right now, a cold surgical focus took over my entire body. I gripped the worn leather of the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. The light turned green and I pressed the accelerator down hard. The drive from the industrial outskirts of the city to the affluent suburbs was a journey between two different realities. I passed strip malls and pawn shops, the places that had become my daily scenery, and merged onto the highway. With every mile, the landscape shifted. Concrete gave way to towering pine trees. Cheap motels were replaced by sprawling golf courses covered in a pristine layer of snow. This was the world I had been banished from, a world of generational wealth and perfectly curated appearances. The dashboard clock read 4:30 in the afternoon. The winter sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawns of the Fairfield estates. I pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates that guarded my parents' neighborhood. The stone pillars on either side were decorated with oversized Christmas wreaths, a picture-perfect display of holiday warmth that made my stomach turn. I rolled down my window. The freezing wind whipped across my face. The security guard stepped out of his heated booth holding a clipboard. He was a new hire, someone who did not recognize my battered 2010 Honda Civic. He looked at the rust on my passenger door and the cracked rear bumper with undisguised suspicion. Name and destination, he asked, his tone clipped and professional. Claire, I am going to the Richard and Brenda residence on Oakwood Drive. He frowned, running his finger down the printed guest list on his clipboard. He shook his head. I do not have a Claire on the expected guest list for that address. They only authorized a catering delivery for this afternoon. I'm going to have to ask you to turn the vehicle around. My father had not even put my name on the gate list. He demanded I come home to surrender my life, but he still treated me like a trespasser. I looked the guard dead in the eye. My voice was dangerously calm. Call the house, dial the number, tell Richard his daughter is sitting at the gate, and if he does not open it right now, I will park this piece of junk right across the entrance lanes and call the local news station to do a live broadcast about his Sunday dinners. The guard blinked, taken aback by the venom in my voice. He retreated into his booth and picked up the telephone. I watched through the glass as he spoke rapidly into the receiver, his eyes darting back to my car. A few seconds later, the heavy iron gates began to slowly swing inward with a low mechanical groan. The guard stepped out and gave me a stiff wave, pointing me through. I rolled the window up and drove into the neighborhood. The streets here were immaculately plowed and salted. Massive colonial and modern farmhouse mansions sat far back from the road, their driveways circular and sweeping. Every house was lit up with elegant white string lights. It was a neighborhood where people worried about country club dues and property taxes, not where their next meal was coming from. I turned onto Oakwood Drive and spotted my parents' house at the end of the cul-de-sac. It was a sprawling 3-story brick colonial with towering Roman columns framing the front door. The driveway was already packed with luxury vehicles. I saw Allison's brand new white Range Rover gleaming under the streetlights. Next to it was Jamal's sleek black Tesla Model S, a car he loved to brag about at every family gathering. My father's silver Mercedes was parked perfectly in the center of the 3-car garage. I pulled my filthy, salt-stained Honda right onto the pristine paver stones of the driveway. I did not bother parking neatly. I angled the car aggressively, blocking Jamal's Tesla from backing out. I slammed the shifter into park and turned off the engine. The sudden silence in the car was deafening. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs. I looked at the massive mahogany front door of my childhood home. Warm yellow light spilled out from the dining room windows. I could see the silhouettes of my family moving around inside, completely oblivious to the hurricane that was about to hit them. They thought I was coming to crawl on my hands and knees. They thought their starvation tactics had finally broken my spirit. I unbuckled my seatbelt and grabbed the printed copy of the mistaken email from the passenger seat. I folded it once and shoved it into the pocket of my worn winter coat. I pushed the heavy car door open and stepped out into the freezing wind. The ice crunched loudly beneath my boots as I marched up the sweeping brick walkway. I did not hesitate. I did not ring the doorbell. I reached out, grabbed the polished brass handle, and pushed the front door open. The blast of warm, climate-controlled air hit my frozen skin the second I crossed the threshold. The house was utterly silent except for the faint sound of classical music drifting from the back of the first floor. The entryway smelled of expensive cedarwood candles, roasted garlic, and the rich, savory aroma of cooking meat. It was the scent of absolute security. It was the scent of the life they had systematically stolen from me. I stood on the polished marble floor of the foyer and looked down at my heavy winter boots. They were caked in dirty snow and gray street salt. With deliberate heavy steps, I walked forward, leaving wet, muddy tracks across the pristine white marble. I did not take off my worn coat. I did not brush the melting ice from my hair. I walked straight down the grand hallway, guided by the soft clinking of crystal glasses and the low murmur of polite laughter. As I approached the arched doorway of the formal dining room, the laughter grew louder. I stopped just outside the frame and looked in. The scene before me looked like a spread from a luxury lifestyle magazine. A massive crystal chandelier cast a warm golden glow over a long mahogany table. The table was set with fine bone china, sterling silver silverware, and tall crystal wine glasses filled with expensive dark red Cabernet. Sitting at the head of the table was my father, Richard. He was wearing a crisp button-down shirt and a cashmere sweater, holding a large carving knife over a massive, beautifully roasted prime rib. To his right sat my mother, Brenda, her blonde hair perfectly styled, wearing a silk blouse and a pearl necklace. On his left were my sister, Allison, and her husband, Jamal. Allison was holding up her wine glass while Jamal leaned in close to her, whispering something that made her giggle. They looked so incredibly happy. They looked like a family that did not have a daughter starving in a freezing car just a few miles away. I stepped into the light of the dining room. My heavy boots made a loud thud against the hardwood floor. The laughter stopped instantly. 4 heads snapped in my direction. The transformation in their faces was immediate and brutal. The warmth vanished from my parents' eyes, replaced instantly by a cold, calculating irritation. Allison let out a loud, dramatic sigh and dropped her hand, splashing a few drops of dark red wine onto the pristine white tablecloth. My mother was the first to speak. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not ask how I had survived the recent blizzard. She physically recoiled, pressing a stiff white linen napkin against her nose. "Good Lord," Claire Brenda said, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "What on earth is that smell? You smell like a wet dog and cheap gasoline. Could you not have at least showered at a public shelter before coming into my home? You are tracking filthy gray slush all over my imported rugs." I stood at the end of the table staring at her. I did not say a word. I let the silence hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. My father slowly lowered the carving knife. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and deep annoyance, the exact look a person might give a stray animal that had wandered into their immaculate backyard. "We told you to come over, Claire," Richard said smoothly, picking up a linen napkin to wipe his hands. "But we expected you to have the decency to present yourself properly. We are having a family dinner. You are interrupting." Allison rolled her eyes and picked up her phone, completely dismissing my presence. "This is exactly what I was talking about," she muttered loudly to no one in particular. "She always does this. She waits until we are perfectly settled and then she barges in to put her misery on display. It is just a manipulation tactic to make us feel bad. We are trying to have a nice evening and now the whole room smells like an alleyway." Jamal shifted in his chair. He was wearing a custom-tailored designer suit, looking every inch the successful tech chief executive officer he claimed to be. He looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile, playing the role of the generous and patient brother-in-law. He let out a soft chuckle and shook his head, reaching into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket. "Hey now, let us take it easy on her, Allison," Jamal said in a smooth, patronizing tone. "It is rough out there in the real world. Not everyone has the discipline to keep their head above water. Sometimes people just need a little charity to get back on their feet." Jamal pulled out a thick leather money clip. I watched him peel a crisp $50 bill from the stack. He leaned back in his chair, extended his arm, and casually tossed the bill across the table. It fluttered through the air and landed right near the edge of the mahogany table, a few inches from my muddy boots. "Go buy yourself a hot meal, Claire," Jamal said, his eyes locking onto mine with supreme arrogance. "Get a hot coffee, maybe a cheap motel room for the night, and take a long shower. Clean yourself up. When you are ready to stop playing the victim and actually join the adult world, give my assistant a call. I might have some entry-level data entry work you can do at my office." The room went quiet again. They were all waiting for my reaction. They were waiting for me to break down. They expected me to fall to my knees, grab the $50 bill with trembling fingers, and cry tears of gratitude for their incredible generosity. They wanted me to beg. They had spent 2 entire years carefully orchestrating my financial and professional destruction just to enjoy this exact moment of supreme power over me. I looked down at the $50 bill resting on the polished wood. Then I looked back up at Jamal. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I did not let a single ounce of the raging inferno inside my chest show on my face. I reached my cold, stiff fingers into the deep pocket of my winter coat. I felt the sharp edge of the folded printer paper. I pulled it out. I walked slowly down the length of the table. Brenda instinctively leaned back in her chair as I passed her, as if my very presence might infect her. I stopped right next to my father. He looked up at me, his jaw clenching in irritation at my refusal to follow his script. I unfolded the paper with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I smoothed out the creases. Without a single word, I extended my arm and slapped the paper directly onto the center of the massive silver platter. The paper landed right on top of the steaming roasted prime rib. The dark red au jus and the hot grease immediately began to seep into the edges of the crisp white page, turning the paper slightly translucent. But the black ink printed on the page remained perfectly bold and entirely legible. The disrespect of the gesture shocked them so deeply that nobody moved for a full 3 seconds. Allison gasped out loud. Jamal sat up straight, his fake smile instantly vanishing. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Richard barked, his face flushing with sudden anger. He reached out to snatch the ruined paper off his expensive dinner. But as his fingers brushed the edge of the page, his eyes caught the bold text printed at the very top. He froze. His hand hovered over the meat. I watched his eyes dart back and forth as he read the first few lines. I watched him recognize the official letterhead of the marketing firm. I watched him recognize his own email address in the sender line. I watched him read his own fabricated words about my supposed felony conviction and mental instability. The transformation was absolute. The arrogant irritation melted off my father's face in less than a second, replaced by a pale, sickening horror. The blood drained from his cheeks so fast he looked like a corpse. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. "What is it?" Brenda asked, her voice tight with sudden anxiety. She leaned over, trying to read the grease-stained paper. "What did she do to the roast?" Richard did not answer her. He slowly looked up from the platter and met my eyes. For the first time in my entire life, my father was looking at me with pure, unadulterated fear. He knew exactly what that piece of paper meant. He knew I had the proof. He knew the game was completely over. The silence in the dining room was no longer just quiet. It was deafening. It was the sound of a carefully constructed empire of lies cracking right down the middle. I leaned down, placing both of my hands flat on the mahogany table, bringing my face just inches from my father's pale, sweating forehead. "Keep your $50, Jamal," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but cutting through the silent room like a razor blade. I think Richard is going to need it to hire a very good defense attorney. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped entirely. My father looked at the grease-stained paper on the prime rib, and I saw the genuine panic of a man who realized he had left a paper trail. But Richard had not built his fortune by crumbling under pressure. He was a master manipulator, and I watched him physically reset his posture. The fear vanished from his eyes, replaced instantly by a look of deep, condescending pity. He let out a slow, heavy sigh and shook his head. He did not apologize. He did not deny sending the email. Instead, he looked at me like I was a tragic, broken thing that he was graciously putting up with. Defense attorney Richard repeated, letting out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Claire, please listen to yourself. You are not making any sense. You are clearly having another paranoid episode. This is exactly why we had to intervene." I stared at him, my expression completely flat. "Intervene?" I asked softly. "You forged a federal background check. You told employers I was a convicted felon. You made me homeless. I did it to protect you," he snapped back, his voice suddenly rising, taking on the tone of a righteous, aggrieved parent. "You were out of control. You were working 80-hour weeks at that agency. You were stressed, manic, and completely losing your grip on reality. The corporate world was eating you alive. I had to pull you out before you did permanent damage to yourself. I gave you an out. I fabricated that document so you would be forced to take a break and come home where we could take care of you." The sheer audacity of his lie was almost breathtaking. He was standing in a multi-million-dollar dining room, wearing cashmere, telling his freezing, starving daughter that he had destroyed her life as an act of profound paternal love. "Protect me," I said, my voice dripping with pure ice. I was up for a promotion to senior director. I had a pristine professional reputation and a six-figure salary. I was not losing my grip on reality. I was finally becoming independent of you, and that is what you could not stand. Brenda slammed her crystal wineglass down on the table. The dark liquid sloshed over the rim. "How dare you speak to your father that way?" she hissed, her face flushed with indignation. "He went through an incredible amount of trouble to monitor your applications and intercept those emails. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to watch your own daughter spiral into mental illness? We have been sick with worry. And look at you now. You break into our home looking like a vagrant, making wild accusations and ruining our Sunday evening. You are clearly unstable." Gaslighting. It was their favorite family pastime. If you call them out on their abuse, they simply convince you that you are crazy for noticing it. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to cry and pull my hair out so they could point at me and say, "Look how unstable she is." But I denied them that satisfaction. I stood perfectly still, breathing evenly. At that moment, Allison let out a loud, dramatic groan. She threw her linen napkin onto her plate and crossed her arms over her chest, pouting like a spoiled child. "Can someone please just take that disgusting, filthy piece of paper off the meat?" Allison whined, glaring at me with absolute hatred. "I am starving and the food is getting cold. Why do you always do this, Claire? Why do you always have to make everything about you? You cannot just be normal. You ruin every single family event. You ruined my college graduation, you ruined Thanksgiving last year, and you even tried to ruin my wedding. You are just a miserable, jealous person." I slowly turned my head and looked at my younger sister. Allison had spent her entire life being handed everything on a silver platter. She lived in a $2 million mansion that she did not pay for, drove cars she did not finance, and wore clothes she did not earn. She was the golden child, perfectly compliant as long as the checks kept clearing. "I ruined your wedding," I repeated, my voice dropping an octave, carrying across the silent dining room. That is a fascinating way to remember that day. Jamal suddenly shifted in his seat. The smug, arrogant smile he had been wearing since I walked in suddenly faltered. "Claire, that is enough," he warned, his voice tight. I ignored him completely, keeping my eyes locked dead on Allison. "Tell me, Allison, did..." Jamal ever explained to you why the catering staff almost packed up their trucks and walked out right before your cocktail hour started? Allison blinked, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. What are you talking about? The catering was perfect. We had the imported Wagyu beef and the champagne tower. Yes, you did, I replied smoothly. But you almost had 200 empty plates and a room full of thirsty guests. Because 30 minutes before the doors opened, the head caterer pulled Jamal into the hallway. Jamal had tried to pay the final $32,000 balance, but his black card declined. Jamal slammed his hand flat against the table. I said, "That is enough, Claire. It was a banking error. A security freeze. It happens to high net worth individuals all the time." I let out a short, sharp laugh. A banking error. He tried 3 different credit cards, Allison. All of them declined. Maxed out. The caterer told him they were leaving. Jamal was practically in tears in the hallway, begging for an extension he was never going to get. Allison slowly turned her head to look at her husband. Her perfect manicured facade was beginning to crack. "Jamal, is that true?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jamal refused to look at her. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, his jaw clenched so tight, I thought his teeth might shatter. "You did not even notice I was missing from the bridal suite?" I continued, my words hitting like rhythmic hammer strikes. I was down in the loading dock, quietly handing the head caterer my personal platinum card. "I paid $32,000 to save your perfect aesthetic wedding, Allison, and I never breathed a word of it to anyone because I did not want to embarrass Jamal on his big day. I smiled in the photos. I gave a lovely toast. I ruined absolutely nothing. I subsidized your entire fake reality." The silence that followed was absolute. Allison stared at Jamal, horror dawning in her eyes as he failed to deny a single word I had just said. For a man who built his entire personality around being a wealthy tech visionary, being exposed as a broke fraud in front of his wealthy in-laws was the ultimate humiliation. I reached down to the polished mahogany table. My freezing fingers brushed against the crisp $50 bill Jamal had tossed at me earlier. I picked it up, folded it neatly in half, and flicked it across the table. It slid smoothly over the wood and came to a stop right in front of Jamal's plate. "Keep your charity, Jamal," I said softly. "It sounds like you need this to pay down your minimum interest rates much more than I need a hot meal." My father had seen enough. The illusion of his perfect family dinner was disintegrating before his eyes, and he realized that the psychological tactics were not working. I was not the broken, pliable daughter he had engineered. He needed to regain control of the room, and he needed to do it immediately. Richard reached down to the floor beside his chair and picked up a thick, leather-bound folder. He tossed it heavily onto the table. It made a loud, authoritative thud that made Brenda jump. "That is quite enough of this fiction," Richard barked, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He pointed a rigid finger at the leather folder. "I do not care what delusions you have concocted in your head, Claire. You are unwell, and this display only proves it further. We are done playing games. You are going to sit down, and you are going to sign these papers right now." I looked at the thick stack of legal documents spilling out of the folder. Even from across the table, I could read the bold black lettering printed across the top page. "Petition for conservatorship and appointment of guardian." The trap was officially sprung. They were not just going to gaslight me. They were going to legally chain me to them for the rest of my life. I reached out and pulled the heavy leather folder closer to me across the polished mahogany table. The thick stack of premium legal paper felt substantial in my cold, stiff hands. I slowly flipped open the cover. The document was completely drawn up, legally formatted, and ready to be filed with the county courthouse. At the very top, in bold capitalized letters, it read, "Petition for appointment of guardian and conservator of the person and estate." I read the first page in total silence, while my family watched me like vultures circling a dying animal. It outlined a complete surrender of my human autonomy. Under the proposed terms of this legal arrangement, my father Richard would become my primary guardian. He would have the absolute legal authority to manage my bank accounts, dictate my medical treatments, authorize psychiatric evaluations, and even decide where I was legally allowed to reside. It was the exact legal mechanism typically used for the elderly suffering from severe dementia or adults with profound cognitive disabilities. They wanted to strip away my basic constitutional rights and reduce me to the legal status of an infant. Richard leaned forward, lacing his fingers together over his half-eaten plate of prime rib. He adopted the smooth, measured cadence of a senior bank manager explaining a loan denial to a foolish customer. "Do not look at it as a punishment," Claire Richard said, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet dining room. "Look at it as a necessary safety net. You have proven over the last 2 years that you are completely incapable of functioning in normal society. You lost your beautiful apartment in the city. You allowed your savings to dwindle to nothing. You are currently living in a filthy vehicle. You clearly suffer from delusions of persecution as evidenced by your ridiculous claims about my emails tonight. This document simply allows us to step in and manage the complex adult responsibilities that you can no longer handle. It is going to be such an incredible relief for you, darling," Brenda added from the other end of the table. She took a delicate sip of her red wine, acting as if we were discussing a simple change in my wardrobe. "You will not have to stress over job interviews or rent payments ever again. We will give you your old childhood bedroom on the second floor. I will make sure the housekeeping staff washes your sheets twice a week. We will provide your meals. You can just rest and let your father handle all the complicated legal and financial matters." I kept my eyes fixed on the thick stack of papers. "And what exactly happens to my career?" I asked, my tone flat and devoid of any emotion. "If I sign this petition, I am legally declaring myself mentally incompetent. I will never be hired as a brand strategist anywhere in the country. You are asking me to permanently execute my professional life." This is where Jamal decided to insert himself back into the conversation, eager to regain the upper hand after I had brutally exposed his financial humiliation at the wedding. He leaned back in his expensive dining chair, swirling the dark red wine in his crystal glass. He offered me a smile so utterly condescending and arrogant that it made the bile rise in my throat. "That is exactly where family steps up," Jamal said, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. "Obviously, with your newly documented mental condition, no reputable marketing firm in the city is going to touch you. And quite frankly, Claire, given that background check your father had to send around to protect those companies, your corporate reputation is already zero. You are a massive liability to any human resources department. But I run my own tech startup. I am the chief executive officer. I make the rules. So I am willing to offer you a lifeline out of the gutter." I looked up from the legal documents and stared directly into Jamal's eyes. I waited for him to deliver his punchline. "If you sign the conservatorship tonight," Jamal continued, gesturing grandly with his free hand, "I will personally guarantee you a position at my tech company starting tomorrow morning. Now let us be realistic. It will not be a senior director role. You are clearly not mentally fit for that kind of high-level corporate stress anymore. It will be an entry-level internship. Data entry, organizing our digital archives, maybe managing the coffee orders and lunch deliveries for my development team." Jamal paused, his smile widening into a predatory grin. "And because of the severe legal complications of your conservatorship, it will have to be strictly unpaid. It is a liability thing. But it will give you somewhere to go every single day. It will give you a strict routine to keep your mind occupied. And it will slowly, over a few years, help rebuild your ruined resume." It was pure, unadulterated extortion. They were holding my basic human survival hostage. Jamal was drowning in massive credit card debt. I knew from the wedding incident that his startup was likely bleeding cash, and he probably could not afford to hire real administrative staff to run his office. So my family had engineered a brilliant sociopathic solution. I would be stripped of my human rights. I would be forced to live under my parents' roof like a heavily monitored prisoner. And I would be shipped off every single day to provide free slave labor to my arrogant brother-in-law. "Think about it," Claire, Jamal said, leaning forward and resting his elbows heavily on the mahogany table. You have been sleeping in the back seat of a Honda Civic for 6 months. The temperature outside is dropping into the single digits tonight. It is freezing. Are you really going to walk out that front door and freeze to death in a parking lot just out of stubborn pride? Sign the papers right now. You get a hot shower, a warm bed, and a job. You have absolutely no other choice. Allison nodded vigorously, eager to pile on the psychological pressure. Exactly, she whined, stabbing a piece of asparagus with her silver fork. You should be thanking Jamal on your hands and knees. He is doing you a massive favor by letting you into his office. If I were him, I would not even let you in my building after the ungrateful way you just spoke to him. But he is a good person, much better than you. Just sign the stupid papers so we can finish our dinner in peace. I looked down at the pen resting on top of the documents. It was a heavy gold-plated Mont Blanc pen. Richard had probably used it to sign million-dollar real estate contracts and lucrative business deals. Now he wanted me to use it to sign away my freedom. They were all watching me intensely. 4 pairs of eyes fixed entirely on my hands, waiting for me to break. They thought they had finally backed me into a dark corner with absolutely no exit. They genuinely believed that the bitter cold, the gnawing hunger, and the endless exhaustion had finally worn my spirit down to nothing. I slowly reached out and picked up the gold pen. The metal felt heavy and cold against my skin. I rolled it slowly between my thumb and index finger, testing its weight. A deeply satisfied smile began to spread across Richard's face. The tension in his shoulders visibly relaxed. He thought he had won. He thought the 2-year campaign of psychological warfare was finally coming to its triumphant conclusion. He was already visualizing the absolute control he would have over my life starting tomorrow morning. An unpaid intern, I repeated softly, staring at the polished gold tip of the pen as it hovered over the signature line. A 35-year-old woman with a decade of high-level corporate strategy experience, fetching coffee for 22-year-old tech employees. And a father who gets total control over my bank accounts, my medical records, and my physical whereabouts. It is for the best, Richard said, his voice dropping into a soothing, deeply authoritative register. Just sign your name on the bottom line, Claire. We can put all this ugliness behind us. We can be a happy family again. I kept the pen hovering just a millimeter above the thick paper. My mind was racing, analyzing every single word they had just said. I was homeless. I was unemployed. My bank accounts had been completely drained 6 months ago just to pay for my car insurance and cheap food. I had absolutely nothing left for them to take. So why did Richard want legal control over my finances? Why go through the expensive process of hiring a corporate lawyer to draft a conservatorship for a daughter who did not have a single dollar to her name? It made absolutely no logical sense. Unless there was money that I did not know about. Money that required my signature to access. I slowly lowered the heavy gold Mont Blanc pen. I did not throw it. I did not snap it in half. I simply let it slip from my cold fingers. It hit the polished mahogany table with a sharp final click that echoed loudly in the silent dining room. I looked directly into my father's eyes. I will not sign anything, I said, my voice completely steady, and I will not be working for a man who cannot even afford his own wedding catering. The illusion of polite, concerned family intervention shattered instantly. Richard slammed his fist down on the table so hard the crystal wine glasses rattled. His face flushed a dark, furious red. The veins in his neck bulged against the collar of his cashmere sweater. "You ungrateful, arrogant little brat!" Richard roared, dropping the wealthy patriarch act entirely. "You have absolutely nothing. You are a homeless vagrant. You are sleeping in a rusted tin can on the side of the road. I am offering you salvation, and you sit in my house and spit in my face. You will sign this petition, or I will make sure the police tow your vehicle tomorrow morning for illegal overnight parking. I will have you thrown into a county holding cell." Jamal scoffed loudly, crossing his arms over his chest. "Let her go, Richard," Jamal said, his voice dripping with pure spite. "If she wants to play the corporate martyr, let her freeze. The intern offer is officially off the table. Good luck finding a bathroom to wash your face in tomorrow morning, Claire." Allison could not resist jumping in, eager to deliver the final psychological blow. She leaned across the table, her blue eyes wide with manic cruelty. "You are a complete embarrassment," Allison hissed, pointing a manicured finger at my face. "You always thought you were so much smarter than us, just because you had some fancy title at a marketing firm. But look at you now. You are pathetic. You are going to end up dead in a ditch somewhere, and we are not going to pay for the funeral. We are trying to do you a favor by taking away your choices because you clearly cannot make good ones. Just sign the stupid paper so we do not have to look at your filthy clothes anymore." I did not flinch. I let their insults wash over me like water. Their anger was not born out of concern. It was born out of panic. They needed my signature. They were desperate for it. And my absolute refusal was driving them to the edge of losing control. But it was my mother who finally broke. Brenda was a woman who despised prolonged discomfort and ugly scenes. She liked things handled quickly and quietly, so she could go back to her perfectly curated life. Watching me defy Richard and humiliate Jamal was too much for her fragile image, obsessed nerves. She threw her linen napkin onto her plate and stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "Enough!" Brenda shrieked, her voice shrill and hysterical. "I am sick and tired of this ridiculous standoff. We have spent months setting this up. We are trying to protect the family assets from your erratic behavior." She pointed a trembling finger at me, her face twisted in a mask of furious indignation. "If you do not sign that document right now, you will never see a single dime of what Grandpa Harrison left you. We have already frozen it, Claire. The lawyers have locked it down. You cannot touch it without our authorization, so you might as well just surrender and let your father take control." The dining room went completely still. It was the kind of absolute vacuum, like silence, that follows a massive explosion. Richard whipped his head around to stare at his wife, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated horror. "Brenda!" he hissed through gritted teeth, his voice laced with pure venom. "Shut your mouth!" Allison looked back and forth between our parents, suddenly realizing that her mother had just crossed a massive, invisible line. Jamal stared down at his plate, the smug expression completely wiped from his face. I stood frozen at the end of the table, my breath hitched in my throat. I did not move a single muscle as my brain rapidly processed the words my mother had just screamed at me. Grandpa Harrison. Harrison had passed away 3 years ago. He was the only person in this family who ever treated me with genuine respect. He was a brilliant commercial real estate developer, a man who built his empire from the ground up. When I was a teenager while Allison was at the country club, I was walking construction sites with Harrison, learning how to read blueprints and negotiate contracts. He was my mentor. When he died, I was completely devastated. A few days after the funeral, Richard had called me into his private study. He sat behind his massive oak desk, looking somber and defeated. He told me that Harrison's business had been secretly failing for years. He told me that the commercial real estate market had crushed him and that Harrison died completely bankrupt. Richard claimed he had to pay for the funeral expenses out of his own pocket to save the family from public embarrassment. There was no will reading, there was no inheritance. There was only a mountain of debt that Richard heroically handled behind closed doors. I had believed him completely. Why would a father lie to his daughter about her beloved grandfather's legacy? But Brenda had just shattered that 3-year-old lie in a matter of seconds. "You will never see a single dime of what Grandpa Harrison left you. We have already frozen it." The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying speed and clarity. There was no bankruptcy. There was no mountain of debt. Grandpa Harrison had left me something. Something substantial. Something so valuable that Richard was willing to commit federal wire fraud and forge criminal background checks just to keep me away from it. That was why they needed the conservatorship. They did not just want to punish me for being independent. They needed legal access to my name. If I signed that petition, I would be legally declaring myself mentally unfit. Richard would become the sole executor of my estate. He would gain immediate, undisputed access to whatever Harrison had left in my name. They had frozen the trust somehow, probably by claiming I was unreachable or unstable, but they could not liquidate the assets without my signature or a judge granting them total guardianship over my life. They had starved me. They had made me homeless. They had systematically destroyed my decade-long career. All of it was a calculated siege to starve me out until I crawled home and signed away a fortune I did not even know I possessed. Richard slowly turned his attention back to me. The panic in his eyes was rapidly transforming into cold, calculated hostility. He realized the secret was out. He knew he could no longer play the concerned father. Claire Richard started his voice low and dangerous. "Let me explain the reality of the situation to you." "Do not bother," I interrupted, my voice ringing clear and sharp. I did not scream. I did not demand to know how much money it was. I did not ask what else they had lied about. Asking questions would mean giving them power. It would mean entering a negotiation with people who had spent 2 years trying to bury me alive. Instead, I looked at the four of them sitting around their lavish dinner table, surrounded by expensive wine and fine china, completely financed by my suffering. I looked at my mother, who had just handed me the key to my own salvation, simply because she could not control her temper. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my car keys. "You are going to regret tonight, Richard," I said softly. "You are going to regret sending that email, and you are going to regret ever underestimating me." "You cannot access it without me!" Richard shouted, standing up from his chair, his fists planted on the table. "You do not even know who the estate lawyers are. You have no money for legal representation. You are a homeless vagrant. If you walk out that door, I will make sure you freeze to death out there." I offered him a single bone-chilling smile. "Watch me." I turned my back on them. I did not run. I walked with slow, deliberate purpose down the grand hallway, my muddy boots leaving a clear trail across their pristine marble floors. I heard Richard shouting my name, his heavy footsteps thudding behind me, but I did not stop. I reached the heavy mahogany front door, pulled it open, and stepped out into the biting winter wind. The cold did not feel painful anymore. It felt like adrenaline. It felt like absolute clarity. I walked down the sweeping driveway and climbed into my battered Honda Civic. I locked the doors, shoved the key into the ignition, and brought the engine to life. Through the windshield, I saw Richard standing on the front porch, his face contorted in rage, watching me back out of the driveway. I shifted into drive and hit the gas. As I drove out of the gated community, leaving the multi-million-dollar mansions behind me in the dark, I felt a new fire burning in my chest. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer a desperate woman begging for a job. I was a woman with a mission. I needed to find out exactly what Grandpa Harrison had left behind. And once I found it, I was going to use it to burn their entire empire to the ground. I drove for 20 miles until the sprawling mansions and manicured lawns of my parents' neighborhood were completely swallowed by the winter darkness. I did not stop until I reached the gritty commercial district on the edge of the city limits, an area filled with warehouses and 24-hour truck stops. I pulled into the flickering neon glow of a cheap diner parking lot. It was the kind of place that did not ask questions and had a free wireless internet connection that reached the parking spaces. I parked under a busted street lamp, turned off the engine, and pulled my laptop from my backpack. The battery was dangerously low, hovering right around 9%, so I had to work fast. I connected to the unsecured network and immediately navigated to the county probate court database. My fingers were stiff and practically frozen, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins made me type with frantic precision. I entered my grandfather's full legal name. The search icon spun for what felt like an eternity before generating a long list of docket numbers. Most of the documents were heavily redacted or sealed by judicial order. But I could see the timeline. Richard had filed an emergency petition to act as the primary executor of the estate mere days after Harrison's funeral. I clicked on a secondary filing dated 6 months ago. It was the exact same month I was evicted from my apartment. The title of the motion made my blood run cold. Motion to suspend beneficiary distributions, pending medical clearance. Richard had legally choked off whatever money Harrison had left me. I was locked out of the files staring at a digital wall erected by expensive corporate lawyers. Suddenly, a pair of blinding LED headlights swept across my windshield. I squinted against the glare as a sleek black Mercedes sedan pulled into the empty parking space directly next to my battered Honda. The contrast was almost comical. The luxury vehicle looked like an alien spaceship sitting in the oil-stained lot of a cheap diner. The engine of the Mercedes cut off. The driver's side door opened. A woman stepped out into the freezing wind. She appeared to be in her early 60s, dressed in a tailored charcoal gray wool trench coat and expensive leather gloves. Her silver hair was cut in a sharp, immaculate bob. She did not look lost, and she certainly did not look like she was here for a late-night plate of cheap diner food. She looked directly at my car, her eyes locking onto me through the frosted glass. She walked over to my passenger side window and tapped lightly on the glass with her leather-clad knuckle. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to start the car and speed away. My family had endless resources. For a split second, I thought Richard had already sent one of his lawyers to intimidate me or serve me with a restraining order. I reached under the passenger seat and wrapped my hand around a heavy metal tire iron I kept for protection. With my other hand, I pressed the button to roll the window down just 2 inches. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice tight and defensive. The woman did not flinch at my hostile tone. She looked at my pale, exhausted face, taking in the reality of my living conditions with a calculating gaze. "You are a very difficult woman to track down, Claire," she said. Her voice was calm, authoritative, and carried the undeniable polish of a seasoned professional. "My name is Diane. I was the senior partner at the firm that handled your grandfather Harrison's commercial real estate empire. More importantly, I was his personal estate attorney." I froze. My grip on the tire iron loosened slightly. "How do you know who I am? How did you find me?" Diane let out a tired sigh, her breath turning to white vapor in the cold air. "I have been hunting for you for over 2 years, Claire. I hired a private investigator 3 weeks ago when I realized your father was actively lying to me. The investigator tracked the license plate of this vehicle. He called me 10 minutes ago and said you had just fled a rather explosive confrontation at the Oakwood Drive residence. I was already in the area, so I told him to stand down and let me approach you directly." I stared at her, processing the information. "Richard lied to you," I echoed. "Please unlock the door," Diane said, glancing around the empty, poorly lit parking lot. "It is 12 degrees outside, and what I have to tell you cannot be shouted through a crack in the glass. I am not working for your father. In fact, after what I have uncovered recently, I am actively working against him." Something in her steady, unwavering gaze reminded me of Harrison. It was the same, no-nonsense, brutally honest demeanor my grandfather used when closing a massive property deal. I let go of the tire iron, unlocked the passenger door, and pushed it open. Diane climbed inside, bringing with her the faint scent of expensive espresso and crisp winter air. She pulled the door shut, sealing us inside the freezing cabin of the Honda. She looked at the laptop resting on my steering wheel, noticing the county probate court website glowing on the screen. "I see you are finally asking the right questions," Diane noted smoothly. "It is a tragedy it took this long. Your grandfather loved you immensely, Claire. You were the only person in that family he actually respected. He knew Richard was a snake, and he knew Jamal was a walking financial liability. Then why did Richard tell me Harrison died bankrupt?" I demanded, the anger bubbling up again. "And how did Richard manage to freeze the estate without my signature? I just saw the docket summary. He suspended my distributions. How is that legally possible without my consent? Because Richard is a master of producing fraudulent documentation," Diane explained, her tone laced with professional disgust. "When Harrison passed away, the terms of his will were absolute. but Richard immediately filed an emergency injunction. He presented my firm and the probate judge with a very convincing stack of medical records. According to the documents your father provided, you had suffered a massive psychological breakdown. I stared at her in stunned silence. A psychological breakdown? Yes, Diane continued. Richard provided signed affidavits from private physicians and invoices from an exclusive, highly secure rehabilitation facility in Arizona. He testified under oath that you were struggling with severe substance abuse and crippling paranoia. He claimed you were completely unreachable, residing in an inpatient lockdown ward, and that handing you a massive financial inheritance would literally sign your death warrant. The sheer scale of the lie was paralyzing. Richard had not just lied to employers, he had committed perjury. He had defrauded a judge. He had forged medical records to paint me as a drug-addicted psychiatric patient just to keep the estate attorneys away from me. That was why they needed the conservatorship tonight. The forged rehab documents were only a temporary fix. A judge had likely demanded proof of my ongoing condition, or perhaps the temporary freeze was expiring. Richard needed my legal surrender to make his control permanent. I tried to reach out to you multiple times over the last 2 years, Diane said, her voice softening just a fraction. But every phone number I had was disconnected. Every email bounced back. Your father intercepted all correspondence. He even hired a woman to impersonate a nurse at the Arizona facility when my paralegal called to check on your status. It was an incredibly sophisticated wall of deception. They took my phone, I whispered, remembering how Jamal had generously offered to upgrade my cell phone plan 2 years ago, right around the time Harrison died. He put me on his corporate tech plan. I thought he was doing me a favor. He was just controlling my communications. Jamal routed my emails through his startup servers. He blocked your messages and probably spoofed the replies. Diane nodded slowly. Exactly. They isolated you completely. But 3 weeks ago, Richard made a fatal error. He filed a petition for conservatorship in the local county court. My firm monitors all legal filings involving our major clients. When I saw the petition, I realized you were not in a locked ward in Arizona. You were right here in the city. That is when I hired the investigator. And when the investigator found you sleeping in this car, I knew your father had orchestrated one of the most disgusting cases of financial abuse I have ever seen in my 40-year career. I closed my laptop. The screen went black, plunging the car back into the dim orange glow of the street lamp. I turned to Diane. I was done asking about the past. I was ready to talk about the future. What exactly did Harrison leave me? Diane reached inside her tailored wool coat. She did not pull out a legal document. She did not pull out a checkbook. Instead, she produced a small, heavy brass key and a silver flash drive. She held them out to me, resting them gently on top of my closed laptop. He did not leave you a simple bank account, Claire. Diane said, a slow, sharp smile forming on her lips. Your grandfather left you the keys to the kingdom. I stared down at the items resting on the cold plastic lid of my laptop. The heavy brass key was worn around the edges, carrying the distinct weight of something old and fiercely protected. Next to it, the sleek silver flash drive caught the dim orange light of the parking lot. I did not reach for them immediately. My mind was still reeling from the sheer magnitude of the deception Diane had just uncovered. But as I looked at the key, a sudden wave of memory washed over me. I remembered being 12 years old, sitting in my grandfather Harrison's massive corner office, watching him lock important client files into a thick steel safe. He always told me that the most valuable things in this world required a lock, a key, and a person who knew how to keep their mouth shut. I looked back up at Diane. The keys to the kingdom. I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. What exactly does that mean? Diane leaned back against the passenger seat of my freezing car, wrapping her tailored wool coat tighter around herself. It means your father has been living a lie for the last 3 years, she stated plainly. When Harrison died, Richard assumed he would inherit the entirety of Vanguard Commercial Properties. He thought he was the natural successor. And to the outside world, that is exactly how it looks. Richard sits in the chief executive chair. He makes the day-to-day operational decisions. He struts around the country club acting like he owns the city skyline. But he does not own it, Claire. He is nothing more than a glorified placeholder. My brow furrowed in confusion. How is he a placeholder? I thought you said Richard forged medical records to freeze the estate. He froze the distribution of the estate, Diane corrected smoothly. But he could not change the fundamental structure of Harrison's true will. Your grandfather was a brilliant man, but he was not blind. He knew exactly who his son was. He knew Richard was obsessed with status and image, but lacked the actual strategic intelligence to maintain a real estate empire. He also knew that Richard would drain the company accounts dry to fund his lavish lifestyle and prop up Jamal's ridiculous tech startup. So Harrison set up a blind trust long before he got sick. Diane reached out and tapped her leather-clad finger against the brass key. That key opens a safety deposit box at First National Trust. Inside that box is the original notarized copy of Harrison's final will and testament. And that document explicitly states that upon his death, 51% of the voting shares of Vanguard Commercial Properties do not go to Richard. They go to you. The air in the car suddenly felt incredibly thin. I stopped breathing for a second. 51%. That was not just a generous financial gift, that was the controlling interest. Harrison had not just left me a trust fund to live comfortably. He had given me absolute legal authority over the entire company. With 51% of the shares, I could outvote my father on any corporate decision. I could block his reckless investments. I could audit the company finances. I could even legally fire him from his position as chief executive officer. He left me the company. I whispered, the reality of it hitting me like a physical blow. But why did I not know about this? If the will was absolute, why did the probate court not transfer the shares to me 3 years ago when he died? Because Harrison wanted to make sure you were ready to carry the weight of the crown. Diane explained, her tone shifting into the precise, calculated cadence of a senior attorney. He knew you were climbing the corporate ladder at your marketing firm. He was incredibly proud of you. But he also knew that handling a massive commercial real estate portfolio required a person who was deeply hardened by the world. He did not want to hand you the keys while you were still young and easily manipulated by your parents. So he placed 3 very specific stipulations on the transfer of the shares. I kept my eyes locked on Diane. What were the stipulations? Diane held up 3 fingers, counting them off one by one. First, the shares would be held in a secure trust until your 35th birthday. Second, upon turning 35, you had to prove to the probate judge that you were gainfully employed in a corporate or strategic capacity. And third, you had to be of entirely sound mind, completely free of any legal guardianship or financial oversight. The silence that followed her explanation was absolute. I could hear the faint, erratic ticking of my battered Honda engine trying to stay warm. I could hear the wind howling against the frosted glass of the windows. It was like staring at the final missing piece of a massive, terrifying puzzle. Every single thing my family had done to me over the last 2 years suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. I just turned 35 last month. I said, my voice eerily calm as the pieces snapped together. Diane nodded slowly. Yes. Which means the trust is officially ripe for execution. The probate court is waiting for you to step forward and claim your shares. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that held absolutely no humor. But I cannot claim them, can I? Because I cannot meet the other 2 stipulations. Exactly. Diane said, her eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and deep professional respect for my quick realization. Your father could not stop you from aging. He knew your 35th birthday was a ticking time bomb, so he aggressively targeted the other 2 conditions. He needed me unemployed, I realized aloud, staring blankly at the dark dashboard. That is why he sent those forged emails. That is why he created a fake criminal record for corporate embezzlement. He knew no reputable firm would ever hire me with a felony background check. He actively sabotaged my career to ensure I would fail the employment clause of Harrison's will. And the conservatorship Diane added, softly guiding me to the final devastating conclusion. The conservatorship handles the sound mind clause. I finished, my voice turning to pure ice. If I sign that petition, I legally declare myself mentally incompetent. I hand over all my financial and medical rights to him. I would officially be under legal guardianship. Diane nodded again. And if you fail those stipulations, the terms of the trust dictate that the 51% of the shares default to the secondary beneficiary, which is Richard. My father did not hate me. He did not think I was a failure. He was utterly terrified of me. He was terrified of the day I would walk into the boardroom, take my seat at the head of the table, and realize he had been squandering Harrison's legacy. He engineered my homelessness, my starvation, and my professional destruction just to trigger a default clause in a legal document. He wanted me broken and begging for a bed so that I would willingly sign away hundreds of millions of dollars without ever knowing it existed. It is brilliant, I said softly, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. It is absolutely sociopathic, but it is brilliant. He manufactured a crisis to prove I was unfit, and then offered to save me from the very crisis he created. He almost got away with it. Diane agreed. He played the concerned, wealthy father perfectly. He had the best corporate defense lawyers drafting that conservatorship. He had my entire firm blocked out with his forged medical documents. If that assistant had not accidentally forwarded you the background check email this morning, you probably would have signed that petition tonight just to escape the cold. I looked down at the silver flash drive sitting next to the brass key. I felt a profound shift deep inside my chest. The exhaustion that had been weighing me down for 6 months was completely gone. The sadness of being rejected by my own parents evaporated, leaving behind a cold, highly functional fury. They had tried to bury me in the dirt, but they had forgotten that I was a strategist. They had forgotten that Harrison taught me how to read the fine print. "What is on the drive, Diane?" I asked, my voice completely steady. "If the original will is in the bank vault, what did you bring me tonight?" Diane reached out and picked up the flash drive. "The will proves what belongs to you," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "But it does not prove what Richard has already stolen. Your father is desperate to finalize this conservatorship because he is not just trying to secure his future. He is trying to cover his tracks." She held the drive out to me. "Plug it in, Claire. It is time you see exactly why Jamal's tech startup is really functioning and why your father is terrified of an audit. Let me show you what federal wire fraud looks like." I took the small silver drive from Diane. My fingers were numb from the cold, but I managed to slide it into the USB port on the side of my laptop. A low battery warning flashed across the top right corner of the screen. 8% remaining. We did not have much time. A file folder popped up on the desktop labeled Vanguard Internal Audit. I double-clicked it and my screen was instantly flooded with dozens of complex financial spreadsheets, banking statements, and legal addendums. Where do I even begin looking? I asked, my eyes scanning the overwhelming wall of data. Diane leaned over the center console, pointing a manicured, leather-clad finger at a specific spreadsheet titled Cayman Holdings. "Open that one first," she instructed. "Look at the incoming wire transfers for the last 18 months. I clicked the file. Rows of transactions populated the screen. I scrolled through the dates, my eyes drawn to the massive numerical values in the deposit column. $200,000, $450,000, $700,000. The money was flowing into a single offshore account like a raging river. "Who owns this account?" I asked. "Look at the outgoing transfers," Diane replied, her voice grim. "Follow where the money goes after it sits in the Caymans for a week to wash the digital trail." I scrolled to the right side of the spreadsheet. The outgoing wire transfers were entirely directed to a single domestic corporate account. The registered name of the receiving entity was Apex Innovations. My breath hitched. Apex Innovations was Jamal's tech startup. It was the company my family constantly praised at every holiday gathering. It was the company Jamal claimed was securing massive rounds of venture capital funding and disrupting the industry. Jamal does not have any venture capital investors, Diane stated flatly, confirming my exact thoughts. His software product was a complete failure. He has not landed a legitimate corporate contract in over 2 years. His company is bleeding cash every single day just to keep the lights on and pay the lease on his premium office space. Apex Innovations should have filed for bankruptcy 18 months ago. But he is still operating, I said, staring at the screen. He is still driving a brand new Tesla and throwing lavish anniversary galas, because someone is actively funding him. I looked back at the incoming transfers to the offshore account. I highlighted the routing numbers of the originating bank. I opened a second document, the master ledger for Vanguard Commercial Properties, the company my grandfather had left to me. I pressed a quick keyboard shortcut to search the document. I pasted the routing number. The screen jumped to a page deep inside the Vanguard ledger. The numbers matched perfectly. My stomach turned violently. It was an estate management account, a liquid cash reserve that Harrison had set aside for building maintenance, property taxes, and emergency repairs across his massive real estate portfolio. Richard has been illegally siphoning liquid cash from your grandfather's estate, Diane explained, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He could not liquidate the actual buildings or transfer the major stock portfolios because the probate court froze the primary assets. But as the temporary executor, he had access to the operational cash accounts. He has been categorizing these massive withdrawals as vague corporate consulting fees and offshore tax strategy investments. He is embezzling. I breathed, the sheer audacity of the crime making me dizzy. He is stealing millions of dollars from the company I own to secretly fund Jamal's failing startup. But why, I asked, looking up at Diane in the dim light of the car. Why would my father risk federal prison to bail out his son-in-law? Richard is greedy, but he is not charitable. He would never hand Jamal millions of dollars just to be nice. Because it was not charity, Diane said, her eyes narrowing. It was a transaction. Look at the dates of the largest wire transfers. I looked back at the screen. A massive wire transfer of $600,000 had been sent to Jamal exactly 2 years and 1 month ago. That was the exact same month I lost my job, I realized aloud. I scrolled down to another massive transfer. $800,000 dated 6 months ago. That was the month I was evicted from my apartment. I whispered the horrifying truth, finally taking full shape. It was a symbiotic criminal enterprise. Richard needed complete, undisputed control of the Vanguard estate to steal the rest of the fortune. To get that, he needed me entirely neutralized. But Richard was a real estate man. He did not know how to forge digital court documents, hack email servers, or manipulate corporate background check databases. But Jamal did. Jamal ran a tech company. He had servers, software developers, and high-level digital access. Jamal is not a visionary. I said, my voice shaking with a potent mixture of rage and absolute clarity. He is a cybercriminal hiding behind a custom-tailored suit. Exactly, Diane confirmed. Richard bought Jamal's technical skills with stolen trust money. Jamal used his startup's infrastructure to intercept your email spoof responses from fake recruiters and create an impenetrable digital wall between you and the outside world. He forged those background checks. He sent them to the hiring managers. Jamal isolated you digitally so that Richard could isolate you legally. They destroyed my life to keep each other rich, I said. I stared at the glowing numbers on the screen. My own father had sold my future to a failing tech CEO just to maintain his grip on a company he did not even own. They had driven me into homelessness, forced me to sleep in a freezing car, and made me believe I was fundamentally broken, all while using my own inheritance to finance the operation. And the conservatorship is their final desperate move, Diane said, her tone urgent. Richard has drained almost all the liquid cash from the operational accounts. Jamal is demanding more money to keep quiet and to keep his fake company afloat. Richard needs to start liquidating the actual real estate properties, but he cannot sell a single building without the primary beneficiary's signature. If I sign that petition tomorrow, I finished for her, I legally hand Richard the right to sell the buildings. He liquidates the entire portfolio, pays off. Jamal hides the rest in the Caymans and leaves me locked in my childhood bedroom with no legal rights to ever question him. The battery warning flashed again. 4% remaining. I looked at Diane. What we had just uncovered went far beyond a simple civil lawsuit over a contested will. This was an orchestrated criminal conspiracy. This is wire fraud, I stated calmly. This is corporate embezzlement, identity theft, perjury, and extortion. This is not just a family dispute over property. This is federal prison time. Diane offered a sharp predator's smile. Yes, it is. I have already contacted a forensic accountant and 2 colleagues who specialize in white-collar criminal prosecution. We have enough digital evidence on this drive to secure search warrants for both the Vanguard corporate office and Jamal's startup servers. But we need to secure the actual physical ledgers from Jamal's office to prove he received the stolen funds knowing their origin. If we bring this to the authorities now, Richard and Jamal will claim it was a simple accounting error and destroy the internal hard drives before the FBI can raid the buildings. I closed the laptop right as the screen flickered and died. The car was plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the faint orange glow of the diner sign outside. They think they have me cornered, I said softly in the dark. Richard told me I have 48 hours to sign the conservatorship before he calls the police and has me thrown in a holding cell. He thinks I am desperate enough to crawl back to Jamal and beg for that unpaid internship just to get out of the cold. Diane looked at me carefully. What are you going to do, Claire? I reached out and pulled the silver flash drive from the dead laptop, gripping it tightly in my fist. I am going to give them exactly what they want. I am going to play the broken, defeated daughter. I am going to go back to that house tomorrow morning and accept Jamal's humiliating job offer. I am going to walk right into the center of his tech company as his unpaid coffee girl. Diane's eyes widened slightly as she understood my plan. You are going to act as a Trojan horse. They locked me out of my own life. I said, a dangerous, absolute calm settling over my heart. Now I am going to walk straight through their front door. Jamal thinks I am a technologically illiterate liability. He is going to hand me an access badge to his office because his fragile ego demands an audience for his superiority. And while he is busy showing off to my sister, I am going to download every single piece of unencrypted financial data he has on his internal servers. I will prepare the authorities, Diane said, her voice filled with deep satisfaction. When you have the internal ledgers, we will strike. I am not just going to strike Diane, I replied, staring out at the frozen parking lot. I am going to let them think they won. I am going to let them set up the signing ceremony for the conservatorship. I want them in a room surrounded by their expensive lawyers, completely convinced they have destroyed me. And then I am going to take everything from them. The sun was just beginning to rise over the frozen city when I pulled my Honda Civic back up to the massive wrought iron gates of the Fairfield Estates. This time, I did not have to threaten the security guard. He saw my car approaching and immediately pressed the button to open the gates. Richard was expecting me. He knew the bitter cold of the night would be my breaking point. I parked in the sweeping circular driveway of my parents' house. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, looking at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My hair was tangled. There were dark, heavy circles under my eyes. I looked exactly like a woman who had reached the absolute end of her rope. I took a deep breath, let my shoulders slump forward, and wiped all the fire from my expression. I had to bury the sharp strategic executive and become the broken, pathetic daughter they desperately needed me to be. I stepped out of the car and walked up the brick pathway. I did not knock. I pushed the heavy mahogany door open and stepped into the warm foyer. The smell of fresh coffee and expensive bacon drifted from the massive gourmet kitchen at the back of the house. I walked slowly down the hallway, dragging my boots slightly on the hardwood floor to make myself sound heavy and exhausted. When I reached the kitchen entrance, the 4 of them were sitting around the massive marble island. Richard was reading the morning paper on his tablet. Brenda was sipping coffee from a delicate porcelain cup. Jamal and Allison were eating perfectly plated eggs and avocado toast. They all stopped and turned to look at me. I stood in the doorway, wrapping my arms around myself, as if I were still freezing. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the floor. "You win," I said, my voice barely above a raspy whisper. I forced my voice to crack slightly on the last word. Nobody spoke for a long moment. I could feel the heavy, suffocating weight of their collective satisfaction filling the room. Richard slowly set his tablet down on the marble counter. He folded his hands together, leaning forward with the victorious posture of a king who had just conquered a rebellious territory. "I am tired," I continued, letting my shoulders drop even further. "I spent the entire night parked behind a dumpster trying to keep the heater running without running out of gas. I am so cold. I cannot do this anymore. You were right about everything. I cannot survive out there. I need help." Brenda let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. She set her coffee cup down and pressed her hand against her chest. "Oh, Claire," she said, her voice dripping with fake maternal pity. "We told you this would happen. You are just not equipped to handle the pressures of the real world on your own. It breaks a mother's heart to see you like this. But I am so glad you finally came to your senses." I slowly looked up, keeping my expression entirely hollow. "I will sign the conservatorship papers," I said softly. "Whenever the lawyers are ready. Just please let me sleep in a real bed tonight." Richard smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the cold, calculating grin of a man who had just secured hundreds of millions of dollars. "That is a very mature decision," Claire, Richard said smoothly. "The corporate attorneys are drafting the final addendums this morning. We will have the official signing ceremony tomorrow at 10 o'clock in their downtown boardroom. Once the ink is dry, you can move your things into the guest room on the second floor." Allison laughed. It was a sharp, mocking sound that echoed loudly in the large kitchen. "My things," Allison repeated, rolling her eyes. "She does not have any things, Dad. She lives in a rusted tin can. We are going to have to burn those clothes she is wearing right now just to get the smell out of the house." I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. I forced myself to look away from her and turned my attention directly to Jamal. He was sitting on a plush leather bar stool, watching me with an expression of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He was practically vibrating with the thrill of having his older, successful sister-in-law begging at his feet. "You said the internship offer was off the table," I said to him, keeping my voice submissive and weak. "But I need to do something during the day. I cannot just sit in this house. Please, Jamal. I will do whatever you need at the office. I just need a routine." Jamal picked up his coffee mug, taking a slow, deliberate sip while he let me sweat. He looked at Richard, sharing a knowing, conspiratorial glance with my father. They had completely bought the performance. They thought they had successfully executed a masterclass in psychological warfare. "I am running a highly innovative tech company," Claire. Jamal said, his tone incredibly condescending. "We deal with complex algorithms, high-level venture capital negotiations, and proprietary software. I cannot have someone with your mental instability touching anything important. And since you are about to be placed under a legal conservatorship, I definitely cannot put you on payroll. It is a massive liability." "I know," I replied quickly, staring at the floor. "I will not touch the software. I will just do the basic tasks." Jamal leaned back, crossing his arms over his expensive designer sweater. "Fine," he said, dragging the word out to maximize his power over me. "But you work on my terms. You will arrive at the office at 8 in the morning sharp. You will handle the coffee orders for the development team. You will organize the physical mailroom, empty the recycling bins, and manually input cold-calling data for the junior sales associates. You will not speak in executive meetings, and you will not embarrass me in front of my staff. Do you understand?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, I understand." Jamal reached into the pocket of his tailored slacks. He pulled out a white plastic keycard attached to a black lanyard. The logo for Apex Innovations was printed on the front. He did not hand it to me. He tossed it onto the marble kitchen island. It slid across the smooth stone and stopped inches from my hands. "That is your all-access intern badge," Jamal said, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Do not lose it. Building security will not print you a new one without my direct authorization. You start today. Go take a shower in the downstairs bathroom, put on some clean clothes from Allison's old closet, and meet me at the office in 2 hours." I reached out and picked up the white plastic card. It felt incredibly light in my hand, but I knew it was the heaviest weapon I had ever held. Jamal thought he was giving me a leash. He had absolutely no idea he had just handed me the master key to his entire criminal enterprise. "Thank you, Jamal," I whispered, clutching the lanyard tightly in my fist. "I will not let you down." I turned around and walked out of the kitchen, heading toward the downstairs guest bathroom. As I walked down the hallway, I could hear Allison making another cruel joke about my unwashed hair, followed by the sound of Jamal and Richard laughing together. They were celebrating their absolute victory. They were already spending the Vanguard commercial real estate money in their heads. I stepped into the luxurious bathroom and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. The sound of their laughter was completely cut off. I stood in front of the massive gold-framed mirror and looked at my reflection again. The defeated, broken woman vanished instantly. My posture straightened. The fire returned to my eyes, burning brighter and colder than ever before. I lifted the white plastic keycard and stared at the blue and silver logo of Apex Innovations. Jamal had built his company on a mountain of stolen money and fake venture capital reports. He had used his internal servers to forge my criminal record and destroy my career. He felt completely untouchable behind his firewalls and his encrypted offshore accounts. But he had made the fatal mistake of letting the enemy directly into the control room. He wanted me to be his coffee girl. He wanted me to fetch documents and empty the trash. That was exactly what I was going to do. I was going to walk through the front doors of his shiny, expensive corporate office. I was going to smile at his receptionist. I was going to pour his coffee. And while he was sitting in his glass-walled office pretending to be a tech visionary, I was going to plug a secure drive into his internal network and rip out the financial heart of his company. I turned the shower handle, letting the scalding hot water fill the room with thick white steam. I stripped off my freezing, filthy clothes and stepped under the water. It was the first hot shower I had taken in over a week. It felt like a baptism. I was washing away the last 6 months of misery, victimhood, and starvation. I was preparing for war. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, my father expected me to sit in a leather chair and sign my entire life over to him. He expected me to quietly surrender the hundreds of millions of dollars Grandpa Harrison had left me. But tomorrow morning, I was not going to be the homeless daughter begging for scraps. Tomorrow morning, I was going to be the chief executive officer of Vanguard Commercial Properties, and I was going to show them exactly what happens when you corner a strategist. I arrived at the sleek glass high-rise downtown at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. The lobby of Apex Innovations was a masterclass in superficial tech startup aesthetics. There were ping-pong tables that looked like they had never been used, neon inspirational quotes glowing on exposed brick walls, and a kombucha tap in the employee lounge. It looked exactly like a company trying desperately to appear successful while actively bleeding millions of dollars. The receptionist did not even look up from her phone when I approached the desk. She simply pointed to a massive stack of cardboard coffee carriers and a printed list of complicated drink orders. That was my entire onboarding process. I was a 35-year-old woman who had spent the last 10 years developing multi-million-dollar corporate branding strategies. Now I was balancing 6 iced oat milk lattes and 4 caramel macchiatos on my forearms while navigating a maze of open-concept desks. The humiliation was designed to be absolute. Jamal had intentionally placed my tiny, cramped desk right next to the office kitchen, ensuring that every single employee would see me whenever they came to get a snack. The developers and junior sales associates were all in their early 20s. They looked at me with a mixture of confusion and pity. To them, I was just the tragic, washed-up older sister who had failed at life and needed a charity handout from their brilliant chief executive officer. I delivered the coffees one by one. I smiled blankly. I apologized when one of the 22-year-old developers complained that his latte did not have enough foam. I swallowed my pride with every single step, keeping my head down and my expression entirely vacant. I let them think I was completely defeated. But behind my blank stare, my mind was working with lethal precision. I was not just delivering coffee. I was mapping the entire floor plan. I noted the blind spots in the security cameras. I tracked the schedules of the senior network engineers. And most importantly, I located the heavy steel door of the primary server room at the far end of the hallway. Jamal had made a catastrophic error born entirely out of his own arrogance. When he tossed that white plastic keycard across the kitchen island that morning, he had given me an all-access building pass. He wanted me to be able to fetch his dry cleaning from the executive suite, grab files from the restricted archives, and restock the kitchen supplies without ever bothering him for permission. He was so focused on treating me like a master key for his personal errands that he completely forgot the digital access permissions tied to that specific badge. He assumed I was too unstable and too technologically illiterate to understand what the keycard actually granted me. By noon, my feet were aching from standing by the printer collating hundreds of pages of useless data entry reports. That was when the glass doors of the main entrance swung open and my sister Allison walked into the office. She looked like she was stepping onto a runway. She was wearing a designer trench coat, carrying 3 massive shopping bags from luxury boutiques, and holding a perfectly manicured hand up to wave at the receptionist. She did not come to the office to see her husband. She came to the office to put on a show, and more specifically, she came to gloat. Allison spotted me standing by the copy machine. Her face lit up with a cruel, predatory joy. She adjusted her designer sunglasses on top of her head and marched straight over to my cramped desk in the corner. Claire Allison called out, her voice intentionally loud enough to make several employees turn their heads and watch us. "Be a dear and take these empty coffee cups to the recycling bin for me, and grab me a sparkling water from the executive fridge." The walk from the parking garage was absolutely exhausting. She dropped 2 sticky, empty plastic cups directly onto the keyboard of my computer. She stood there with her hands on her hips, waiting for me to snap. She wanted me to yell at her so she could play the victim in front of Jamal's entire staff. She wanted to prove to everyone that I was the crazy, ungrateful sister. I looked at the sticky cups. I looked at Allison. And then I offered her a completely submissive, empty nod. "Of course, Allison," I said softly. "Right away." I picked up the trash and turned toward the kitchen. As I did, the heavy glass door of the corner office opened. Jamal stepped out wearing a custom-tailored blazer, grinning from ear to ear as he saw his beautiful wife commanding the room. He walked over, wrapping his arm around Allison's waist, playing the role of the perfect wealthy power couple. They stood right in the middle of the open concept floor plan, laughing loudly about their dinner reservations and their upcoming vacation plans. The junior employees practically tripped over themselves to compliment Allison's outfit and laugh at Jamal's terrible jokes. It was a sickening display of stolen wealth. But it was also the exact distraction I needed. Every single pair of eyes in the office was glued to Jamal and Allison. The network engineers had left their desks to join the crowd. The hallway leading to the back of the building was completely empty. I threw the plastic cups into the trash can and kept walking. I slipped past the frosted glass of the conference room and moved silently down the corridor. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a hammer, but my hands were completely steady. I reached the heavy steel door of the server room. There was a small black card reader mounted on the wall. I took the white lanyard from around my neck. I pressed the plastic card against the reader. The machine let out a soft beep. The light shifted from red to green. The heavy magnetic lock disengaged with a solid click. I pushed the door open, slipped inside, and let it pull shut behind me. The room was freezing cold, filled with the loud, continuous hum of towering server racks. The air smelled of ozone and hot electronics. I moved quickly to the primary administrative terminal, sitting on a metal desk in the corner. The screen was dark. I tapped the spacebar to wake it up. A password prompt appeared. I did not panic. Diane and I had prepared for this exact scenario in the diner parking lot. Jamal was a fraud, which meant his technical security was likely just as hollow as his business model. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small silver flash drive Diane had given me. It was not just a storage device. It contained an executable script designed by one of Diane's white-collar cybersecurity experts. I plugged the drive into the terminal. The screen flickered. A black command window popped up, running lines of green code faster than my eyes could track. Within 10 seconds, the script bypassed the local administrative password and granted me full root access to the Apex Innovations internal network. I opened the master file directory. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I did not bother looking at the software algorithms or the client pitch decks. I went straight for the financial archives. I found a massive encrypted folder labeled Operations Ledger. I clicked it. The sheer volume of financial crimes displayed on the screen was staggering. I saw the exact unencrypted routing numbers matching the offshore accounts we had found the night before. I saw the massive wire transfers coming directly from the Vanguard Commercial Properties Trust. I saw fake invoices created to make the stolen money look like legitimate corporate consulting fees. I saw payroll documents showing Jamal was paying himself an astronomical salary while stiffing his vendors. It was the holy grail of federal evidence. It was everything the Federal Bureau of Investigation would need to lock Richard and Jamal in a federal penitentiary for the next decade. I initiated the mass download. I routed the entire folder directly to the secure encrypted cloud server Diane had set up for me. A progress bar appeared on the screen. It was moving agonizingly slow. The file was massive. I stood in the freezing server room staring at the blue bar creeping across the monitor. 50%, 60%. Suddenly I heard the sound of heavy footsteps echoing in the hallway outside the steel door. Someone was walking toward the back of the building. If Jamal or one of his engineers walked in and saw me standing at the root terminal, the entire plan would collapse. They would confiscate the drive, destroy the servers, and call the police to have me arrested for corporate espionage before I could ever reach Diane. 75%. The footsteps were getting closer. I could hear Jamal's voice. He was giving Allison a tour of the facility, walking right down the corridor toward the server room. "Look at this setup, babe," Jamal was bragging loudly just on the other side of the wall. "We have the most advanced data processing hardware in the city. We are practically printing money in here. 90%. My chest tightened. I hovered my hand over the flash drive, ready to rip it out of the port and hide it if the door handle moved. 99%. The heavy steel door handle suddenly jiggled. Jamal was testing the lock to show his wife the secure room. 100%. Transfer complete. I yanked the silver flash drive from the port. The screen immediately locked, returning to the standard password prompt just a fraction of a second before the door swung open. I spun around, dropping the flash drive into the deep pocket of my slacks. Jamal stood in the doorway, his arms still wrapped around Allison. His smug smile vanished the second he saw me standing in the freezing room. His eyes darted to the dark computer terminal and then back to my face. The color drained from his cheeks. For a fleeting second, I saw genuine panic in his eyes. "What the hell are you doing in here?" "Claire," Jamal demanded, his voice dropping into a dangerous, sharp tone. "This is a highly restricted area. You are not authorized to be in this room." I looked at him with wide, innocent eyes. I let my shoulders slump forward, playing the confused, incompetent intern perfectly. "I am so sorry, Jamal," I stammered, holding up my hands nervously. "I was just looking for the extra boxes of sparkling water for Allison. The receptionist said they were in the storage closet at the end of the hall." I swiped my badge on the door and it just opened. I did not touch anything. "It is really cold in here." Jamal stared at me, searching my face for any sign of deception. But all he saw was the broken, exhausted woman he had bullied in his kitchen that morning. His massive ego simply could not process the idea that I was capable of outsmarting him. The panic faded from his eyes, replaced quickly by his usual seething irritation. "You are an absolute idiot," Jamal spat, shaking his head in disgust. "Get out of here before you trip over a wire and crash the entire network. Go back to the kitchen and scrub the coffee pots. If I catch you wandering around my servers again, I am calling your father to come pick you up early." "Yes, Jamal." "I am sorry," I whispered, keeping my head bowed, as I shuffled past them and out the door. Allison let out a dramatic sigh as I walked away. "She really is completely useless," she muttered to Jamal. "I do not know how you tolerate having her in your building. You are a saint for putting up with her." I walked back down the hallway toward my cramped desk by the kitchen. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. I reached into my pocket and ran my thumb over the smooth metal of the flash drive. I had the ledgers. The trap was fully loaded. All I had to do now was wait for the morning. The sun set, bringing another freezing night to the city, but my parents had no intention of letting me rest. I was ordered to attend the Apex Innovations 2-year anniversary gala. The event was being held at the Grand Plaza, one of the most expensive luxury hotels in the downtown district. Walking into that ballroom felt like walking into a crime scene wrapped in silk and crystal. There were towering floral arrangements that cost more than most people made in a month. Waiters in crisp tuxedos circulated with silver trays of top-tier champagne and imported caviar. A massive ice sculpture of the Apex logo dominated the center of the room, slowly melting under the heat of the expensive stage lighting. I looked around at the sheer, sickening opulence of it all, knowing that Jamal's failed software had not paid for a single drop of this champagne. Every flower, every piece of ice, every rental fee was paid for with stolen cash from Vanguard Commercial Properties. It was my grandfather's money. It was my inheritance being burned in front of my face to inflate the ego of a fraud. Allison had insisted on dressing me for the evening. She dug into the very back of her sprawling walk-in closet and pulled out a dull, shapeless gray dress that was at least 2 sizes too big. It was a calculated move to ensure I looked like a withered shadow standing next to her in her custom designer gown. I wore it without a single complaint. I stood in the far back corner of the ballroom holding a glass of sparkling water, trying to remain entirely invisible. But Richard found me. My father materialized beside me, holding a glass of expensive scotch. He did not look at me directly, keeping his eyes on the crowd to maintain his pristine public image. "You did well today," Richard murmured, his voice low and devoid of any real warmth. "Jamal said you were completely obedient at the office." "That is a good first step, Claire." I kept my eyes on the floor. "Thank you," I whispered. Richard took a sip of his scotch. "The corporate attorneys have finalized the petition. We are signing tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. I want you to understand something very clearly. You have 48 hours before the temporary medical freeze on your records expires. If you do not sign that document tomorrow, I will call the police. I have private physicians on retainer who will testify that you are a danger to yourself. I will tell them you stole from my house, I will have your vehicle impounded, and I will have you committed to a state psychiatric ward. You will never see the outside of a padded room." The sheer cruelty of his threat was staggering. He was willing to destroy my freedom, completely locking me in a psychiatric facility for the rest of my life, just to cover his embezzlement. "I will sign it," I said softly, letting my voice tremble just enough to sell the fear. "I will be there tomorrow." Richard smiled, a cold, satisfied curve of his lips. "Good girl. Now stand here quietly and try not to ruin Jamal's big night." A microphone whined with feedback, drawing everyone's attention to the main stage. Jamal strutted up to the podium, adjusting his tailored tuxedo jacket. The room erupted into applause. Jamal beamed, soaking up the unearned admiration like a sponge. "Welcome, everyone!" Jamal's voice boomed through the high-fidelity speakers. 2 years ago, Apex Innovations was just an idea, a vision to disrupt the tech industry. Today we are standing at the absolute pinnacle of software development. I watched him lie with such fluid, practiced ease. It was nauseating. He went on to thank his dedicated team, praising their hard work, completely ignoring the fact that their paychecks were funded by federal wire fraud. Then he turned his attention to Richard, who was standing near the front row with Brenda. "I want to give a special thank you to my incredible father-in-law, Richard," Jamal said, placing a hand over his heart. "Richard was our first major seed investor. He believed in my vision when nobody else did. His guidance and his extremely generous capital backing made all of this possible." The crowd politely applauded Richard, who raised his glass in a mock salute. They had no idea Richard was not investing his own money. He was laundering stolen trust funds through a fake tech empire. But Jamal was not finished. His ego required more than just business accolades. He needed to prove he was a moral savior as well. He looked out over the crowd, his eyes scanning the room until they locked onto me, standing in the shadows at the back. "At Apex, we do not just care about algorithms and profit margins," Jamal said, his voice dropping into a solemn, theatrical tone. "We care about community. We care about lifting people up when they have hit rock bottom. And tonight, I want to share a very personal story about that commitment." My stomach plummeted. I knew exactly what he was doing. "My sister-in-law Claire is with us tonight," Jamal announced, gesturing toward the back of the room. Suddenly, a bright white spotlight swung across the ballroom ceiling and hit me squarely in the face. I was instantly blinded, exposed to the stares of 200 wealthy investors and socialites. "Stand up tall," Claire Jamal urged through the microphone. "Do not be shy." The crowd turned to look at me in my baggy, oversized gray dress. I could hear the faint whispers rippling through the room. The junior developers I had served coffee to earlier that day were staring at me with deep pity. "Claire has had a very difficult few years." Jamal continued, his voice dripping with weaponized pity. "She has been battling severe personal demons, mental health struggles. She completely lost her way, her career, and her home. But family never gives up. Yesterday we brought Claire into the Apex office. We gave her a job. It is not glamorous, but it is a second chance. We are actively rehabilitating her, giving her a safe space to rebuild her shattered life." The ballroom erupted into loud, sustained applause. Some people even cheered. They were applauding Jamal for his incredible generosity, completely unaware that he had personally forged the background checks that made me homeless in the first place. Allison was standing near the stage, looking back at me with a smirk of absolute triumph. She loved watching me be paraded around like a rescued stray dog. The humiliation was designed to break my spirit right before the signing ceremony. It was a public branding, ensuring that everyone in their social circle viewed me as a mentally unstable charity case. I stood perfectly still under the blinding glare of the spotlight. I did not cover my face. I did not run out of the room crying. I let them look at me. I let Jamal enjoy his sickening round of applause. Because while they were all staring at the broken woman in the oversized dress, I was looking past the spotlight toward the heavy double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom. Standing just inside the doorway, partially obscured by the shadows, was Diane. She was wearing a sharp, tailored black suit. In her right hand, she held a thick leather briefcase. I knew exactly what was inside that briefcase. It held the printed, unencrypted financial ledgers I had downloaded just hours ago. It held the irrefutable proof of Richard and Jamal's massive criminal conspiracy. It held the true will of Grandpa Harrison waiting to be executed. Diane did not clap. She did not smile. She just stood there watching the man on stage dig his own grave with every single word he spoke. Slowly, her eyes shifted through the crowd and locked onto mine. The distance between us was vast, filled with people who thought I was nothing but a pathetic failure. But in that moment, only Diane and I knew the truth. I gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. She returned it with a slow blink, tapping her finger twice against the leather handle of the briefcase. The trap was not just set. The steel jaws were open, and Jamal and Richard had willingly stepped right into the center. Let them applaud, I thought, staring at my father and my brother-in-law as they basked in their fake glory. Let them drink the expensive champagne and pretend they own the world. Because tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, I am going to burn their entire reality to the ground. 10 o'clock the next morning arrived with a brutal, freezing wind rattling the massive glass windows of the downtown financial district. I walked through the revolving doors of the towering skyscraper that housed my father's corporate legal team. The lobby was a cavernous space constructed entirely of imported Italian marble and brushed steel designed specifically to intimidate anyone who walked through it. I rode the high-speed elevator up to the 42nd floor in total silence. I was wearing the same oversized gray dress Allison had forced me to wear to the gala the night before. I had not slept a single minute, but I was not tired. The adrenaline coursing through my veins was a powerful electric current. I stepped out of the elevator and walked across the thick plush carpet toward the primary executive boardroom. When I pushed the heavy glass door open, the scene inside looked like a masterclass in corporate execution. The boardroom was massive, featuring a long, polished mahogany table that could easily seat 30 people. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the city skyline. It was the skyline my grandfather Harrison had helped build. It was the skyline I legally owned. Sitting at the far end of the table, bathed in the morning sunlight, was my family. They were practically vibrating with victory. Richard sat at the absolute head of the table, dressed in a bespoke navy pinstripe suit, looking every inch the undisputed patriarch. Brenda sat to his right, wearing an elegant beige cashmere sweater and her signature string of pearls. Jamal and Allison lounged in the expensive leather chairs next to her. Jamal was checking his expensive watch, a smug, satisfied smirk plastered across his face. Allison was mindlessly scrolling on her phone, looking incredibly bored by the legal proceedings, but visibly eager for the final result. Sitting to my father's left was a man I did not recognize, but I knew his type immediately. He was a senior partner at the firm, an expensive corporate bulldog named Mr. Stanton. He had a thick stack of documents resting on the table in front of him, neatly organized with bright yellow sticky tabs protruding from the edges. "Ah, Claire," Richard said, his voice echoing loudly in the spacious room. He did not stand up to greet me. He simply gestured toward the single isolated chair positioned at the complete opposite end of the long mahogany table. "You are right on time. Please take a seat. We have a lot of important paperwork to get through this morning." I did not say a word. I walked slowly across the room, letting my shoulders slump forward, keeping my head bowed. I pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat down facing them. It was the perfect physical representation of the battle lines. It was me, isolated and supposedly broken against a united front of pure greed. Mr. Stanton cleared his throat and adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses. "Good morning, Claire," the lawyer said, adopting a tone of practiced bureaucratic sympathy. "I know this is an incredibly difficult day for you, but I want to assure you that this firm has drafted this petition with the utmost care for your personal well-being. We are here to establish a legal framework that will protect you from the severe stresses of independent living." I kept my eyes fixed on the polished surface of the table. "Protect me," I echoed softly, my voice completely hollow. "Yes," Stanton continued, shuffling the thick stack of papers. "By signing this document, you are voluntarily entering into a comprehensive conservatorship. Your father, Richard, will be designated as your primary legal guardian. He will have total executive authority over your medical decisions, your psychiatric care, your physical residency, and all of your financial assets. You will no longer have the legal capacity to enter into contracts, open bank accounts, or make binding life decisions without his explicit written consent." It was horrifying to hear the clinical, sanitized way the lawyer described the total erasure of my human rights. He was talking about legally burying a 35-year-old woman alive, and he was using the calm, measured tone of a man reading a weather report. Brenda leaned forward, placing her perfectly manicured hand flat on the table. She put on her best concerned mother face, a look she had perfected over decades of country club luncheons. "It is going to be a beautiful new chapter for you, Claire," Brenda said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You will not have to worry about a single thing ever again. We have already had the housekeeper prepare the upstairs guest room for you. It has the lovely view of the rose garden. You can just rest, read your books, and let your father carry the heavy burdens. You are finally safe." Allison let out a short, mocking laugh without looking up from her phone screen. "Safe from yourself, mostly," Allison muttered. "Try not to ruin the guest room the way you ruined your last apartment. I do not want the house smelling like a homeless shelter." Jamal chuckled, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me with the supreme arrogance of a man who genuinely believed he was the smartest person in the room. He thought his fake tech startup and his stolen money made him a genius. "Do not forget our deal," Claire Jamal said, pointing a finger at me across the long table. "You still have a job waiting for you at Apex Innovations. The receptionist is expecting you back by noon to finish sorting the physical mail. Signing these papers does not mean you get to sit around and be lazy. You still need to earn your keep under my roof." I looked at the four of them. They were so incredibly confident. They had spent 2 years orchestrating my downfall, intercepting my emails, forging my criminal record, and draining my grandfather's trust fund to pay for their luxury cars and lavish parties. They had starved me in the dead of winter, and now they were sitting in a multi-million-dollar boardroom waiting for me to hand them the final key to their stolen kingdom with a stroke of a pen. Richard reached out and placed his hand firmly on top of the thick stack of legal documents. He slid the heavy petition across the smooth mahogany wood. It glided effortlessly, coming to a stop directly in front of me. The bright yellow sticky tabs practically glowed under the recessed lighting, marking the exact spots where I was supposed to sign my life away. Richard reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out the same heavy gold-plated Mont Blanc pen he had tried to force on me at the Sunday dinner. He stood up from his chair, walked slowly down the length of the table, and placed the gold pen right on top of the signature line. He leaned over, resting his hands on the table, bringing his face close to mine. His eyes were cold hard and entirely devoid of paternal love. "Pick up the pen, Claire," Richard ordered, dropping the sympathetic facade entirely. The room was suddenly dead silent. "Pick up the pen, sign your name on the yellow tabs, and let us end this miserable phase of your life. This is for your own good. You fought a brave fight, but you lost. It is time to submit." The silence stretched out heavy and suffocating. The lawyer watched me with mild professional interest. Brenda held her breath, waiting for the massive payday she knew was coming once I was legally incapacitated. Allison finally put her phone down, eager to witness my absolute defeat. Jamal grinned, anticipating his next massive wire transfer from the Vanguard accounts. I looked down at the gold pen resting on the thick legal paper. Then very slowly, the defeated, broken posture melted away from my body. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back. I lifted my chin. The terrified, hollow expression vanished from my face, replaced by a mask of absolute terrifying calm. I did not reach for the pen. I did not cry. I did not look at my father. Instead, I casually raised my left arm and pushed back the sleeve of my oversized gray dress. I looked at the silver face of my watch. It was exactly 10:04 in the morning. Richard frowned, clearly confused by my sudden shift in demeanor. He tapped his finger aggressively on the table right next to the document. I said, "Pick up the pen, Claire. We do not have all day. What are you waiting for?" I lowered my arm. I looked past my father, past the smug faces of my family, and locked my eyes directly on the heavy frosted glass doors at the far end of the boardroom. "I am waiting for my legal counsel," I said, my voice ringing out clear, sharp, and completely steady. Before Richard could even process the words coming out of my mouth, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. The heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open with a forceful, commanding push. Diane stepped through the threshold. She was not wearing a winter coat today. She wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that screamed absolute authority, looking every inch the senior estate attorney my grandfather had trusted with his empire. But she did not come alone. Flanking her were two tall men in dark conservative suits. The gold shields clipped to their leather belts caught the morning sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. They were federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically assigned to the white-collar crime division. Behind them stood a fourth person, a severe-looking man clutching a thick leather briefcase. He was a forensic accountant. Mr. Stanton, the expensive corporate bulldog my father had hired, immediately stood up from his chair. His face flushed with indignation. "Excuse me," Stanton barked, pointing a pen at the intruders. "This is a private corporate boardroom. We are in the middle of a highly sensitive legal proceeding. You cannot just barge in here without authorization." Diane ignored the lawyer completely. She walked straight past him and locked her eyes directly on Richard. My father recognized her instantly. The transformation in his face was spectacular to witness. The smug, victorious patriarch vanished in a fraction of a second. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a wax figure. His jaw went slack, and a bead of cold sweat immediately formed on his temple. He knew exactly who Diane was, and he knew that her presence here meant his 2-year campaign of deception was over. I stood up from my isolated chair at the far end of the long mahogany table. I reached into the worn satchel I had brought with me, the bag they all assumed held my meager homeless belongings. I pulled out 3 thick manila folders. I dropped them onto the polished wood. The loud smack echoed like a gunshot through the silent, tense room. I placed my hand on the first folder and pushed it firmly down the center of the table. It slid over the smooth surface, coming to a dead stop right next to the conservatorship petition and the gold Mont Blanc pen. Folder number 1. I announced, my voice clear and projecting across the room so the federal agents could hear every single word. The forged background checks, the spoofed emails from fake corporate recruiters, the digital logs proving that Jamal used the internal network servers at Apex Innovations to intercept my job applications. He actively sent out federal felony records under my name, claiming I was convicted of corporate embezzlement. Jamal jumped out of his leather chair as if it had suddenly caught fire. He stared at the manila folder like it was a live explosive. "That is impossible," Jamal stammered, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "You have no proof of that. My servers are encrypted." "Not impossible, Jamal," I countered, offering him a sharp, merciless smile. "Just incredibly arrogant. When you tossed me that all-access intern badge yesterday morning so I could fetch your coffee, you forgot that it granted me root access to your primary server room. I walked right in and downloaded your entire unencrypted administrative drive while you were busy showing Allison your fake empire." Before Jamal could even form a response, I picked up the second folder and slid it down the table. It landed right on top of the first one. "Folder number 2, I said, maintaining my absolute calm. "The original notarized last will and testament of my grandfather Harrison. The document that explicitly proves Richard is not the owner of Vanguard Commercial Properties, but merely a temporary executor. The will states that 51% of the voting shares transfer entirely to me upon my 35th birthday, provided I am gainfully employed and of sound mind." Stanton, realizing the catastrophic legal liability his law firm was suddenly exposed to, snatched the folder. His eyes scanned the legal document rapidly. He looked at Richard, a profound professional horror dawning on his face. "Richard, is this document authentic?" Stanton demanded, his voice trembling. "Did you hide a primary beneficiary from this firm while asking us to draft a conservatorship?" Richard did not answer. He was staring at the federal agents, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. He was completely paralyzed by fear. "By the way, Jamal," I continued, my voice dripping with weaponized irony, "I want to sincerely thank you for officially hiring me yesterday. That unpaid internship fulfilled the gainful employment clause of my grandfather's will perfectly. And since I am actively refusing to sign this fraudulent conservatorship today, my medical and legal autonomy remains entirely intact. The shares are officially mine, which means I currently own 51% of this corporate firm, and I own the very building we are sitting in." The room was spinning into absolute chaos, but I was not finished. I picked up the third and final folder. It was the thickest of the three. I slid it down the table with forceful precision. Folder number 3, I said, delivering the final fatal blow, the internal financial ledgers from Apex Innovations. The bank statements from the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The documented, irrefutable proof that Richard has been embezzling liquid cash from the Vanguard estate and wiring it directly to Jamal to fund his failing startup. $4.2 million in stolen trust funds laundered through fake corporate consulting fees over the last 2 years. The forensic accountant stepped forward, placing his heavy briefcase on the table. We have already traced the routing numbers, the accountant stated in a flat, clinical voice. The funds originated from the Vanguard operational accounts and ended up in the Apex Innovations payroll accounts. The lead federal agent finally spoke, stepping toward the head of the table. Richard, we have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and perjury. Jamal, you are also being charged with wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit extortion. The united front of the perfect wealthy family shattered in less than a second. Survival instincts kicked in, and the absolute worst traits of their personalities exploded into the open. Jamal backed away from the table, his hands raised in the air, pointing frantically at my father. I had nothing to do with the embezzlement, Jamal shouted, his voice shrill and desperate. It was all him. Richard forced me to do it. He said if I did not help him block her emails, he would cut off my funding. Apex was struggling. He used the money to buy my technical skills. I am a victim of his financial manipulation. I will testify against him. I will tell you everything he did. Richard slammed his hands on the table, his face turning a deep, furious purple. You absolute coward! Richard roared, his authoritarian mask completely gone. You came to me begging for cash because you lied to your venture capitalists. You were drowning in debt. You came up with the idea to forge the background checks. You built the fake emails. You are going down for this, Jamal. Allison stood frozen near the windows, looking back and forth between her father and her husband. The reality of the third folder finally pierced her materialistic brain. She turned to Jamal, her eyes wide with manic horror. Struggling, Allison shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the boardroom. What do you mean Apex was struggling? You told me we just secured a $10 million valuation last month. You told me we were rich. Jamal looked at his wife, the facade of the wealthy tech visionary completely stripped away. We have absolutely nothing, Allison, he confessed, his voice breaking under the pressure. The luxury cars are leased. The mansion has a massive second mortgage that we are defaulting on. The only money we had for the last 2 years was the cash Richard stole from your grandfather. We are broke. Allison let out an ear-piercing scream. The realization that she was no longer a wealthy socialite, but the wife of a broke federal criminal, completely broke her fragile mind. She lunged at Jamal, her manicured nails raised, swinging her fists wildly at his chest. You liar, she sobbed hysterically, hitting him over and over again. You complete fraud. You ruined my life. I am not going to be married to a broke convict. I am filing for divorce today. The federal agents had to step forward and physically separate Allison from Jamal, pulling her back as she kicked and screamed obscenities at the man she had proudly flaunted just 24 hours ago. Amidst the absolute chaos of the arrests, the screaming, and the lawyer frantically gathering his papers to flee the room, my mother Brenda suddenly moved. She watched the agents place handcuffs on Richard's wrists. She realized that her husband was going to a federal penitentiary. She realized that her golden child daughter was entirely penniless. And she realized that the daughter she had treated like garbage for decades was now the multi-million-dollar owner of a massive commercial real estate empire. Brenda knew her country club memberships, her designer clothes, and her entire social standing were about to evaporate. Brenda bypassed the struggling agents and rushed around the large mahogany table toward me. Tears were streaming down her face. It was a perfectly executed performance of sudden, overwhelming maternal clarity. Claire, Brenda cried out, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Oh, my sweet girl, I am so sorry. I had no idea. I did not know the extent of what Richard was doing behind closed doors. I was lied to as well. We are family, Claire. We have to stick together through this terrible tragedy. I am your mother." She reached out her arms, stepping close, attempting to pull me into a tight emotional embrace. She expected me to crumble. She expected the lonely, formerly homeless daughter to finally accept the scrap of maternal affection she had been desperately craving her entire life. She thought a simple hug could erase 2 years of psychological torture and secure her a place in my new financial empire. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I simply raised my hand and planted my palm firmly against the center of her expensive cashmere sweater, stopping her dead in her tracks. My arm was rigid. The physical boundary was absolute and impenetrable. "We are not family, Brenda," I said. My voice was completely devoid of anger, sadness, or any emotion at all. It was just a cold, undeniable fact. Family does not watch you freeze in a car for 6 months while drinking imported champagne bought with your stolen inheritance. Brenda gasped, her eyes widening in shock at my physical rejection. "Claire, please," she begged, her fake tears faltering. "You made your choice when you let him forge those documents." I continued, staring directly into her terrified eyes. "You knew exactly what he was doing. You chose your luxury over my survival. Now you have to live with the consequences of that transaction. Do not ever try to touch me again." I pushed her back just hard enough to make her stumble slightly on her expensive heels. Brenda stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently, finally realizing that the bridge between us was not just burned, it had been entirely vaporized. The lead federal agent stepped around Brenda and approached my father. Richard did not resist. All the fight and arrogance had completely left his body. He held out his wrists, his face pale and slack as the cold steel handcuffs clicked into place. The sound was incredibly loud in the echoing boardroom. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent recited, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Jamal, however, was not going quietly. When the second agent grabbed his arm, Jamal started to thrash his expensive designer suit, twisting awkwardly. He was crying now, actual tears streaming down his face as the terrifying reality of federal prison finally set in. "Please," Jamal begged, looking over his shoulder at me as the agent forced his hands behind his back. "Claire, please tell them to stop. We can work this out. I will give the money back. I will sign whatever you want. I have a tech company. I can pay you back." I looked at him with absolute disgust. "You do not have a tech company, Jamal," I said, my voice echoing across the large room. "You have a server room funded entirely by my grandfather's stolen money, and you cannot pay me back because the federal government is going to seize every single asset you falsely claim to own. You are bankrupt, and you are going to prison." Mr. Stanton, the expensive corporate lawyer my father had hired, was actively panicking. He practically threw the conservatorship petition into his leather briefcase, snapping the brass lock shut with trembling hands. He realized his firm had been used to facilitate a massive financial crime, and he wanted absolutely nothing to do with the fallout. He did not say goodbye to Richard. He did not look at Brenda. He simply tucked his briefcase under his arm and sprinted out of the boardroom doors, fleeing the scene to protect his own legal liability. Allison watched her husband being dragged toward the heavy glass doors by the federal agents, but she was not crying for him. She did not scream his name or tell him she loved him. She spun around to face me, her blue eyes wild with a new, much more selfish panic. "Wait," Allison demanded, her voice shrill and trembling. "If Jamal is bankrupt and his company accounts are frozen, what happens to my house? The mortgage payments come directly from his corporate account. If the government seizes his assets, the bank is going to foreclose on my home. Where am I supposed to live?" I looked at my younger sister. Even now, watching her father and her husband being escorted out in handcuffs by federal authorities, Her only concern was her own personal comfort. I turned to Diane, who was standing calmly by the mahogany table. Diane reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of premium watermarked paper. She handed it to me. I held the paper up so Allison could see the official county seal stamped at the very top. "The bank is not going to foreclose on your house, Allison," I said smoothly, "because Jamal does not actually have a mortgage." Allison blinked, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What are you talking about? Of course we have a mortgage. We live in a $2 million estate in the suburbs." I shook my head slowly. "You live in a $2 million estate that Richard purchased outright in cash 2 years ago. He used a shell company funded entirely by the Vanguard Commercial Properties Trust. He hid the asset deep inside the corporate ledger to avoid paying massive tax penalties, and he let you live there rent-free so you could pretend you married a highly successful tech entrepreneur." The color completely drained from Allison's face. Her mouth opened in silent horror. "No," she whispered, taking a stumbling step back. "No, that is my house. My name is on the mailbox." "Your name is on the mailbox," I corrected her, keeping my tone perfectly level, "but my name is on the deed. As the majority shareholder and the sole legal executor of the Vanguard estate, I am the legal owner of that property, and I do not recall ever signing a lease agreement with you." Allison stared at me, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. The arrogant golden child who had mocked my oversized clothes just yesterday was suddenly realizing that she did not own a single thing in this world. Her entire reality had been subsidized by the very sister she despised. "You have exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises," I told her, my voice turning to pure ice. "You can take your clothes, your shoes, and your personal items. But the furniture, the imported rugs, and the artwork belong to the estate. If you are not completely off the property by Friday morning, I will have the county sheriff physically remove you for trespassing." "You cannot do that," Allison shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the glass windows. "Where am I supposed to go? I do not have a job. I do not have any money. I have never worked a day in my life. I cannot live on the street like a vagrant." I looked her up and down, taking in her custom designer gown and her expensive diamond earrings. I tilted my head, offering her the exact same condescending smile Jamal had given me at the Sunday dinner. "It is rough out there in the real world, Allison. Not everyone has the discipline to keep their head above water. Sometimes people just need a little charity to get back on their feet." Allison let out a guttural sob, covering her face with her hands as she collapsed heavily into one of the expensive leather boardroom chairs. She wept uncontrollably, mourning the loss of her unearned wealth. I turned my attention back to Brenda. My mother was standing near the center of the room, looking completely lost and entirely pathetic. She had spent her entire adult life curating an image of absolute perfection. She cared more about what the other women at the country club thought of her than she did about the survival of her own flesh and blood. Now she was staring at the smoking ruins of her fake empire. With Richard arrested for federal wire fraud, the government was going to freeze every single joint bank account they possessed. The sprawling colonial house on Oakwood Drive would likely be seized by federal authorities to pay for the millions of dollars Richard owed in criminal restitution. Brenda was not just losing her husband. She was losing her social standing, her unlimited credit cards, and her entire identity. "What am I supposed to do, Claire?" Brenda asked, her voice small and wavering. "The platinum cards are going to decline. The country club dues are scheduled for next week. How am I going to explain this to my friends? They are going to read about the federal indictment in the morning paper." I looked at the woman who had happily allowed me to starve in a freezing car just so she could maintain her comfortable, luxurious lifestyle. "You do not have any friends, Brenda," I said coldly. "You have an audience, and the show is officially over." I turned my back on her. I picked up my worn satchel from the floor, adjusted the strap over my shoulder, and walked out of the boardroom alongside Diane. I did not look back at the crying women. I stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the ground floor, and felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the last 2 years finally lift from my shoulders completely. 1 month later, the winter snow had begun to melt, giving way to the early signs of spring across the city. The bitter cold that had haunted me during my time living in the Honda Civic was nothing more than a distant memory. I was sitting on the 50th floor of the Vanguard Commercial Properties headquarters, occupying the massive corner office that used to belong to my grandfather Harrison. The room was bathed in warm, natural sunlight. I had ordered building maintenance to completely strip the office of every single piece of furniture Richard had ever touched. The heavy, oppressive oak desk was gone, replaced by a sleek, modern glass table. The dark leather sofas were swapped for bright, comfortable seating. The air smelled of fresh espresso and expensive lilies. I sat in my new ergonomic CEO chair, looking over the daily financial reports. The legal fallout from the boardroom confrontation had been swift and absolutely brutal. Richard was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, having been denied bail due to his significant flight risk and access to hidden offshore accounts. He was facing over 20 years in federal prison for orchestrating the embezzlement scheme. Jamal, true to his cowardly nature, had immediately flipped on my father. He took a plea deal, handing the federal prosecutors every single digital log and encrypted email connecting Richard to the wire fraud. But Jamal's cooperation did not save him entirely. The judge was disgusted by the cruelty of the forged background checks. Jamal was currently facing a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence in a medium-security federal penitentiary. Apex Innovations was completely liquidated by the government to pay off the furious venture capitalists he had defrauded. My intercom buzzed softly, pulling me away from the financial spreadsheets. "Yes, Sarah," I said, answering my executive assistant. Ms. Claire Sarah's professional voice came through the speaker. "There is a woman in the ground floor lobby demanding to see you. She says her name is Allison. Building security stopped her at the turnstiles, but she is refusing to leave until she speaks with you. Should I have them escort her off the premises?" I leaned back in my chair, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city skyline. "Send her up," I replied calmly. 5 minutes later, the heavy glass doors of my office opened. Allison stepped inside. The visual transformation was absolutely staggering. She was no longer the perfectly polished, arrogant socialite who wore designer gowns and expensive sunglasses. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy, unwashed ponytail. She was wearing a faded, oversized sweater and plain denim jeans. The dark circles under her eyes mirrored the exact exhaustion I had worn just a month prior. She stood nervously in the center of my massive office, looking around at the sheer luxury of my new reality. She looked at the expensive artwork on the walls and the panoramic view of the city. Then she looked at me, sitting behind the desk. Claire Allison started, her voice trembling with forced humility. "Thank you for seeing me. I know you are incredibly busy running the company now." I did not offer her a seat. I just rested my hands on the glass desk and waited for her to speak. "I had to move out of the house." Allison continued, staring at the floor. "The sheriff came exactly when you said he would. I have been crashing on a friend's couch for the last 3 weeks, but her husband says I have to leave by tomorrow. I do not have anywhere to go. Mom is staying at a cheap motel near the federal courthouse trying to deal with Dad's lawyers. I cannot stay with her." She finally looked up, her blue eyes filled with genuine desperation. "I found a tiny studio apartment on the edge of the city. It is cramped and it smells like bleach, but it is a roof. The landlord needs first and last month's rent plus a security deposit. I applied for a job at a retail clothing store, but I do not get my first paycheck for 3 weeks. I just need a loan, Claire. Just enough to cover the apartment deposit and some groceries. I promise I will pay you back." I looked at my younger sister. I remembered the way she had mocked my worn clothes. I remembered her telling me I was going to end up dead in a ditch and that they would not pay for the funeral. I remembered her ordering me to throw away her sticky coffee cups while she paraded around Jamal's office. I slowly opened the top drawer of my desk. I reached inside and pulled out a crisp green $50 bill. I placed it flat on the smooth glass surface. I extended my index finger and slid the bill across the massive desk until it hung slightly off the edge right in front of where Allison was standing. Allison looked down at the $50 bill. Confusion washed over her face quickly, followed by a deep burning humiliation as she recognized the exact amount. "Buy a hot meal, Allison," I said softly, echoing the exact words Jamal had used on me. "Get a hot coffee, maybe a cheap motel room for the night, and take a long shower. Clean yourself up. When you are ready to stop playing the victim and actually join the adult world, give my assistant a call. I might have some entry-level data entry work you can do in the mailroom." Allison stared at the bill, her hands shaking violently. She wanted to scream at me. She wanted to throw the money back in my face and call me a monster. But she was finally experiencing the crushing reality of absolute poverty. She reached out with trembling fingers, snatched the $50 bill off the desk, and turned around without saying a single word. I watched her walk out of my office, her shoulders slumped in total defeat. I pressed the button on my intercom. "Sarah, please have security escort my sister out of the building and revoke any future visitor passes under her name." I leaned back in my grandfather's chair and turned toward the massive windows. The city below was bustling with life, unaware of the quiet war that had just been won on the 50th floor. I took a deep breath of the warm, clean air. I did not just survive their attempts to destroy me. I outsmarted them. I outlasted them, and I took everything they valued. I did not just get my life back. I took an empire. They thought destroying my reputation would make me obedient. They thought starving me out would force me to surrender my autonomy. They forgot that when you have absolutely nothing left to lose, you have nothing holding you back from burning the house down. Have you ever had to legally cut ties with toxic family members to protect your own peace and future? Tell me your story in the comments below.